He lit the 2 lanterns, placed them on the stern seat, then made the bed. The tiller ropes creaked. He opened one of the windows, banging the frame to loosen the swollen wood, and stared down at the Calliope's flattened wake. A thin moon lit the sea and silvered some small clouds, but no ships were visible. Above him a Frenchman laughed on the poop deck. Sharpe took off his sabre and coat, but he was too tense to sleep, and so he just lay on the bed and stared at the white-painted planks above him and thought of Grace next door. He supposed that she and her husband would sleep apart, as they had on every other night, and he wondered how he could let her know that he was now ensconced in luxury. Then he became aware of raised voices coming from the neighbouring quarters, and he swung off the bed and crouched beside the thin wooden partition. There were at least 3 men in the foremost cabin, all speaking in French. Sharpe could make out Lord William's voice, which sounded angry, but he had no idea of what was being said. Perhaps his lordship was complaining about the food, and that thought made Sharpe smile. He went back to the bed, and just then Lord William yelped. It was an odd sound, like a dog. Sharpe was on his feet again, bracing himself against the slow roll of the ship. There was a silence. Once more Sharpe crouched by the flimsy wooden partition, and heard a French voice saying a word over and over. Bijou, it sounded like. Lord William spoke, his voice muffled, then grunted, as if he'd been hit in the belly, and had all the wind driven from him. Sharpe heard the door between Lord William's 2 cabins open and close. There was a click as the locking hook was dropped into its eye. A Frenchman's voice sounded again, this time from the stern cabin that shared the wide window with Sharpe's makeshift quarters. Lady Grace answered him in French, apparently protesting. Then she screamed. Sharpe stood. He expected to hear Lord William intervene, but there was silence. Then Grace gave a second scream, which was abruptly stifled, and Sharpe hurled himself at the partition. He could have gone into the corridor, and back into the next-door cabin, but breaking down the panelled partition was the quickest way to reach Grace, and so he hammered it with his shoulder, and the thin wood splintered, and Sharpe tore his way through, bellowing as though he went into battle. Which he did, for Lieutenant Bourset was on the bed where he was holding down Lady Grace. The tall lieutenant had torn her dress open at the neck and was now trying to rip it further, while at the same time keeping one hand over her mouth. He turned to see Sharpe, but he was much too slow, for Sharpe was already on the lieutenant's broad back, with his left hand tangled in Bourset's greasy hair. He hauled the Frenchman's head back and chopped the side of his right hand onto the lieutenant's neck. He hit him once, twice. Then Bourset heaved Sharpe off and twisted to swing a huge fist. Someone hammered on the cabin door, but Bourset had locked it. Bourset had taken off his coat and sword belt, but he seized the cutlass handle, dragged the blade free, and slashed at Sharpe. Lady Grace was hunched at the head of the bed, clutching the remnants of her dress to her neck. There were pearls scattered on the bed. Bourset had evidently come to plunder Lord William's possessions, and found Grace the most delectable. Sharpe threw himself back through the ruins of the bulkhead. His own sabre was on the bed, and he dragged it from the scabbard and swung the blade as the big Frenchman clambered through the splintered panels. Bourset parried the stroke, then, as the sound of the blade still echoed in the cabin, he charged at Sharpe. Sharpe tried to spear the sabre into Bourset's belly, but the lieutenant contemptuously swatted the steel away and punched the hilt of the cutlass into Sharpe's head. The blow made Sharpe reel, scattering his vision with sparks and darkness as he fell backwards. He rolled desperately to his right as the cutlass chopped down into the deck. Then he swung the sabre in a wild, back-handed and clumsy stroke that did no damage, but served to make Bourset step back. Sharpe scrambled to his feet, his head still ringing, and heard the locked door between Lord William's 2 cabins being broken down. Bourset grinned. He was so tall that he had to stoop beneath the deck beams, but he was confident, for he had heard Sharpe, who was staggering slightly. The cutlass hilt had drawn blood, which trickled from Sharpe's forehead down his cheek. He shook his head, trying to clear his vision, knowing that this brute of a man was just as savage and quick as he was himself. The lieutenant ducked under a beam and lunged at Sharpe, who parried. Then Bourset snarled and charged, the cutlass sweeping like a reaping hook, and Sharpe threw himself back against the cabin's forward bulkhead, and the Frenchman knew he'd won. except that Sharpe bounced back from the wall, his sabre held like a spear, and stretched forward so that the curved tip ripped into Beausset's throat. Sharpe swerved to his left to avoid the cutlass's heavy riposte, and it seemed to him that his thrust had not done any real damage, for he had felt no resistance to the blade. But Beausset was wavering, and blood was pouring down his coat. The Frenchman's right arm fell so that the cutlass tip struck the deck. He stared at Sharpe with an expression of puzzlement, and put his left hand to his neck where the blood was pulsing dark, and then, with a lurch, he fell to his knees and made a gurgling sound. A Marine kicked through the shattered bulkhead and stared wide-eyed at the big lieutenant, who was looking up at Sharpe in faint surprise. Then, as if poleaxed, Beausset fell hard forward, and a wash of blood spilled across the deck and vanished between the cracks. The Marine raised his musket, but just then an authoritative voice snapped in French, and the man lowered the gun. Major Dalton thrust the Marine aside and saw Beausset's body, which was still twitching. "You did this?" the Major asked, kneeling and lifting the lieutenant's head, then dropping it swiftly as more blood welled from the wound in the neck. "What else was I to do with him?" Sharpe asked belligerently. He wiped the sabre's tip on the hem of his coat, then pushed past the Marine and peered through the broken bulkhead to see that Lady Grace was still crouched on the bed, her hands at her throat, shaking. "It's all right, my lady," he said. "It's over." She stared at him. Dalton spoke in French to the Marine, evidently ordering the man to report to the quarterdeck. Then Lord William peered round the shattered partition, saw the corpse, and looked up at Sharpe's bloodied face. "What?" he began, but then was bereft of words. There was a graze on Lord William's cheek where he had been struck by Beausset. The Frenchman was unmoving now. Lady Grace was still sobbing, gasping huge breaths, then whimpering. Sharpe tossed his sabre onto Pullman's bed and stepped past Lord William. "It's all right, my lady," he said again. "He's dead." "Dead?" "He's dead." A silk-embroidered dressing-gown, presumably Lord William's, was hung over the foot of the bed, and Sharpe tossed it to Lady Grace. She draped it about her shoulders, then began shaking again. "I'm sorry," she sobbed. "I'm sorry." "There's nothing for you to be sorry about, my lady," Sharpe said. "You will leave this cabin, Sharpe," Lord William said coldly. He was shaking slightly, and a trickle of blood traced his jawbone. Lady Grace turned on her husband. "You did nothing!" she spat at him. "You did nothing!" "You're hysterical, Grace, hysterical! The man hit me," he protested to anyone who would listen. "I tried to stop him. He hit me." "You did nothing," Lady Grace said again. Lord William summoned Lady Grace's maid, who, like him, had been under the Marine's guard in the day cabin. "Calm her down, for Christ's sake," he told the girl, then jerked his head to indicate that Sharpe should leave the bedroom. Sharpe stepped back through the ruined bulkhead to discover that most of the great cabin's passengers had come upstairs and were now staring at Beausset's corpse. Ebenezer Fairley shook his head in wonder. "When you do a job, lad," the merchant said, "you do it proper. Can't be a drop of blood left in him. Most of it's dripped down onto our bed." "I'm sorry," Sharpe said. "Not the first blood I've seen, lad, and worse things happen at sea, they tell me." "You should all leave." Lord William had come into Pullman's quarters. "Just leave!" he snapped pettishly. "This ain't your room," Fairley growled, "and if you were half a man, my lord, neither Sharpe nor this corpse would be here." Lord William gaped at Fairley, but just then Lady Grace, her hair ragged, stepped over the splinters of the partition. Her husband tried to push her back, but she shook him off and stared down at the corpse, then up at Sharpe. "Thank you, Mr. Sharpe," she said. "Glad I could be of service, my lady," Sharpe replied, then turned and braced himself as Major Dalton led a Frenchman into the crowded cabin. "This is the new captain of the ship," Dalton said. "He's an officier marinier, which I think is the equivalent of our petty officer." The Frenchman was an older man, balding, with a face weathered and brown by long service at sea. He had no uniform, for he was not a wardroom officer, but evidently a senior seaman who seemed quite unmoved by Beausset's death. It was plain that the Marine had already explained the circumstance, for he asked no questions, but simply made a clumsy and embarrassed bow to Lady Grace and muttered an apology. Lady Grace acknowledged the apology in a voice still shaking from fear. "Merci, monsieur." The officier marinier spoke to Dalton, who translated for Sharpe's benefit. "He regrets Bourset's action, Sharpe. He says the man was an animal. He was a petty officer till a month ago, when Montmorenc promoted him. He told him he was on his honour to behave like a gentleman, but Bourset had no honour." "I'm forgiven?" Sharpe asked, amused. "You defended a lady, Sharpe," Dalton said, frowning at Sharpe's light tone. "How can any reasonable man object?" The Frenchman made arrangements for a sheet of canvas to be nailed over the broken partition, and for the lieutenant's body to be taken away. He also insisted that the lanterns be removed from the window. Sharpe stood the lanterns on the empty sideboard. "I'll sleep in here," he announced, "just in case any other bloody Frenchman gets lonely." Lord William opened his mouth to protest, then thought better of it. The corpse was taken away, and a piece of frayed sailcloth nailed over the partition. Then Sharpe slept in Pullman's bed as the ship sailed on, taking him to captivity. The next 2 days were tedious. The wind was light, so the ship rolled and made slow progress, so slow that Tufnell guessed it would take nearer 6 days to reach Mauritius, and that was good, for it meant there was more time for a British warship to see the great captured Indiaman wallowing in the long swells. None of the passengers could go on deck, and the heat in the cabins was stifling. Sharpe passed the time as best he could. Major Dalton lent him a book called Tristram Shandy, but Sharpe could make neither head nor tail of it. Just lying and staring at the ceiling was more rewarding. The barrister tried to teach Sharpe backgammon, but Sharpe wasn't interested in gambling, and so Fazakerly went off to find more willing prey. Lieutenant Tufnell showed him how to tie some knots, and that passed some hours between the meals, which were all bourgoux enlivened with dried peas. Mrs. Fairley embroidered a shawl. Her husband growled and paced and fretted. Major Dalton attempted to compile an accurate account of the battle at Assaye, which needed Sharpe's constant advice. The ship sailed slowly on, and Sharpe didn't see Lady Grace during the daytime. She came to his cabin on the second night, arriving while he was asleep, and waking him by putting her hand on his mouth so he didn't cry out. "The maid's asleep," she whispered, and in the silence that followed, Sharpe could hear Lord William's drug-induced snores beyond the makeshift canvas screen. She lay beside Sharpe, one leg across his, and didn't speak for a long time. "When he came in," she finally whispered, "he said he wanted my jewels. That was all, my jewels. Then he told me he was going to cut William's throat if I didn't do what he wanted." "It's all right," Sharpe tried to soothe her. She shook her head abruptly. "And then he told me that he hated all aristos. That's what he said, aristos. And said we should all be guillotined. He said he was going to kill us both and claim that William had attacked him and that I had died of a fever." "He's the one feeding the fishes now," Sharpe said. He'd heard a splash the previous morning and knew it was Bourset's body being launched into eternity. "You don't hate aristos, do you?" Grace asked after a long pause. "I've only met you, your husband, and Sir Arthur. Is he an aristo?" She nodded. "His father's the Earl of Mornington." "So, I like 2 out of 3, Sharpe said. "That's not bad." "You like Arthur?" Sharpe shrugged. "I don't know that I like him, but I'd like him to like me. I admire him." "But you don't like William?" "Do you?" She paused. "No. My father made me marry him. He's rich, very rich, and my family isn't. He was reckoned a good match, a very good match. I liked him once, but not now. Not now." "He hates me," Sharpe said. "He's frightened of you." Sharpe smiled. "He's a lord, though, isn't he? And I'm nothing." "You're here, though," Grace said, kissing him on the cheek. "And he isn't." She kissed him again. "And if he found me here, I would be ruined. My name would be a disgrace. I'd never see society again. I might never see anyone again." Sharpe thought of Malachi Braithwaite, and was grateful that the secretary was mewed up in the steerage, where he couldn't add to his suspicions of Sharpe and Lady Grace. "You mean your husband would kill you?" Sharpe asked her. "He'd like to. He might." She thought about it. but he'd probably have me declared mad. It isn't difficult. He'd hire expensive doctors who'd call me an hysterical lunatic, and a judge would order me locked away. I'd spend the rest of my short life shut in a wing of the Lincolnshire house, being spoon-fed medicines. Only the medicines would be mildly poisonous, so that, mercifully, I wouldn't live long. Sharpe turned to look at her, though it was so dark that he could see little but the blur of her face. "He could really do that?" he asked. "Of course," she said. "But I stay safe by behaving very correctly, and by pretending that William doesn't take whores and mistresses. And, of course, he wants an heir. He was overjoyed when our son was born, but has hated me ever since he died, which doesn't stop him trying to give me another." She paused. "So my best hope of staying alive is to give him a son, and to behave like an angel. And I swore I'd do both. But then I saw you, and I thought, why not lose my wits?" "I'll look after you," Sharpe promised. "Once we're off this boat," she said quietly. "I doubt we'll ever meet again." "No," Sharpe protested. "No!" "Shh!" she whispered, and covered his mouth with hers. End of Side 4. Side 5. By dawn she was gone. The view from the stern window was unchanged. No British warship was in pursuit. There was just the endless Indian Ocean stretching away to a hazed horizon. The wind was fresher, so that the ship rolled and thumped, dislodging the chess pieces that Major Dalton had arrayed on the stern seat in a plan of the Battle of Versailles. "You must tell me," the Major said, "what happened when Sir Arthur was unhorsed." "I think you must ask him, Major." "But you know as much as he, surely." "I do," Sharpe agreed, "but I doubt he's fond of telling the story, or of having it told. You might do better to say he fought off a group of the enemy and was rescued by his aides." "But is that true?" "There's truth in it," Sharpe said, and would say no more. Besides, he couldn't remember exactly what had happened. He remembered sliding off his horse and slashing the sabre in haymaking cuts. He remembered Sir Arthur being dazed and standing in the shelter of a cannon's wheel. And he remembered killing. But what he remembered clearest of all was the Indian swordsman who had deserved to kill him. For the man had swung his tulwar in a scything stroke that had struck the nape of Sharpe's neck. That stroke should have beheaded Sharpe, but he had been wearing his hair in the soldier's queue, bound around a leather bag that would normally have been filled with sand, only instead Sharpe had concealed the great ruby from the Tipu Sultan's hat in the bag, and the big jewel had stopped the tulwar cold. The blow had released the ruby, and Sharpe remembered how, when the vicious fight was over, Sir Arthur had picked up the stone and held it out to him with a puzzled expression. The general had been too confused to recognize what it was, and probably thought it was nothing but a prettily coloured pebble that Sharpe had collected. Goddamn Cromwell had the pretty pebble now. "What was Sir Arthur's horse called?" Dalton asked. "Diomede," Sharpe said. "He was very fond of that horse." He could remember the gush of blood that spilt onto the dry ground when the pike was pulled from Diomede's chest. Dalton questioned Sharpe till late afternoon, making notes for his memoir. "I have to do something with my retirement, Sharpe, if ever I see Edinburgh again." "Are you not married, sir?" "I was. A dear lady. She died." The Major shook his head, then stared wistfully through the stern window. "We had no children," he said softly, then frowned as a sudden rush of feet sounded from the quarter-deck. A voice could be heard shouting, and a heartbeat later the calliope yawed to larboard and the sails hammered like guns firing. One by one the seals were sheeted home, and the ship, after momentarily wallowing in the swells, was sailing smooth again. Only this time she was beating up into the wind on a course as near northerly as the small crew could hold. "Something's excited the Frenchies," the Major said. No one knew what had caused the northwards turn, for no other ship was visible from the cabin portholes, though it was possible a lookout high in the rigging had seen some topsails on the southern horizon. The motion of the ship was more uncomfortable now, for she was slamming into the waves and heeling over. Then, when the supper was carried to the passengers, the officier marinier ordered that no lights were to be shown, and promised that anyone who disobeyed him would be thrust down into the ship's hold, where fetid sea-water slopped and rats ruled. "So, there is another ship," Dalton said. "But has she seen us?" Sharpe wondered. "Even if she has," Dalton said gloomily, "what can we do?" Sharpe prayed it was the Pucelle, Captain Chase's French-built warship that was as quick a sailor as a Rivenant. "There is one thing," he said. "What?" "I need Tufnell," Sharpe said. And he went down to the officers' quarters in the great cabin and hammered on the lieutenant's door, and after a brief conversation took the lieutenant and Dalton to Ebenezer Fairlie's cabin. The merchant was robed for bed and had a tasselled nightcap falling over the left side of his face, but he listened to Sharpe, then grinned. "Come on in, lad. Mother, you'd have to get up again. We've got some mischief to make." The problem was a lack of tools, but Sharpe had his pocket-knife, Tufnell had a short dagger, and the Major produced a dirk, and the three men first pulled up the painted canvas carpet in Fairlie's sleeping cabin, then attacked a floorboard. The board was made of oak over 2 inches thick. It was old oak, seasoned and hard, but Sharpe could see no alternative except to make a hole in the deck and hope that it was in the right place. The men took it in turns to hack and scratch and carve and cut the wood, while Mrs. Fairlie produced a kitchen steel from a travelling chest and periodically sharpened the 3 blades that were slowly, so very slowly, digging through the plank. They made 2 cuts, a foot apart, and it took till well past midnight to cut through the board and lift the section out. They worked in the dark, for once the hole was made, Fairlie lit a lantern that he shielded with one of his wife's cloaks, and the 3 men peered into the darkness below. At first, Sharpe could see nothing. He could hear the grating of the tiller rope, but he couldn't see it. And then, when Fairlie dropped the lantern into the hole, he saw the great hemp rope just a foot or so away. Every few seconds, the taut rope would move an inch or more, and the creaking sound would echo through the stern. The rope was fastened to the tiller, which was the bar that turned the Calliope's great rudder. From the tiller, the rope went to both sides of the ship, where it ran through pulleys, before returning to the centre of the ship, where 2 more pulleys led the rope up to the ship's wheel, which was really 2 wheels, one in front of the other, so that as many men as possible could heave on the spokes when the ship was in heavy seas and high winds. The twin wheels were connected by a hefty wooden drum, round which the tiller rope was tightly wound, so that a turn of the wheel pulled on the rope and transferred the motion to the tiller bar. Cut that rope, and the Calliope would be rudderless for a while. "But when'd you cut it, eh?" Fairlie asked. "Wait for daylight," Dalton suggested. "It'll take some cutting," Sharpe said, for the rope was near 3 inches thick. It ran in a space between the main and lower decks, and Fairlie put the canvas carpet back into place not only to disguise the hole, but to keep the rats from coming up into his cabin. "How long will it take to replace that rope?" the merchant asked Tufnell. "A good crew could do it in an hour." "They'll have some good seamen," the merchant said, "so we'd best not waste their efforts now. We'll see what morning brings." That night brought no Lady Grace. Perhaps Sharpe thought she'd already looked into Polman's cabin and found Sharpe absent. Or perhaps Lord William was awake and watchful, wondering if a rescue was closing on the night-shrouded Calliope. So Sharpe wrapped himself in a blanket and slept until a fist knocked on his door to announce the breakfast burgoo. "There's a ship on the starboard bow, sir," the seaman who'd brought the cauldron said softly. "You can't see it from here, but she's there all right. One of ours, too." "Navy?" "We reckon she is, sir. So it's a race to Mauritius now." "How close is she?" 7-8 miles. Fair way, sir. And she has to tack to cut us off, so it'll be precious close, sir." He lowered his voice even more. "The froggies have taken down their ensign, so we're flying our old colours. But that won't help 'em if it's a warship. She'll come and look at us anyway. Ensigns don't mean nothing when there's prize money to be gained." The news had spread through the ship, elating the passengers and alarming the French crew, who tried to coax their prize into showing her best speed. But to the passengers in the stern, who could neither see the other ship nor determine what happened on the Calliope's deck, it was a slow and agonizing morning. Lieutenant Tufnell suggested that the 2 ships must be on converging courses, and that the Calliope had the advantage of the wind, but it was bitterly frustrating not knowing for sure. They all wanted to cut the tiller rope, but knew that if they severed it too soon, the French might have time to make a repair. No dinner was served at midday, and perhaps it was that small hardship which persuaded Sharpe that the rope was best cut. "We can't tell when the best moment is," he argued, "so let's give the buggers a headache now." No one demurred. Fairlie pulled back the carpet, and Sharpe thrust his sabre into the hole and sawed the blade back and forth on the rope. The rope kept moving, not by much, but enough to ensure that it was difficult keeping the sabre on the same spot. But Sharpe grunted and sweated as he tried to find the leverage to bring all his strength onto the blade. "Shall I try?" Tufnell asked. "I'm managing," Sharpe said. He couldn't see the rope, but he knew he had the blade deep in its fibres now, for the blade was being tugged back and forth with the rudder's small movements. His right arm was on fire from the wrist to the shoulder, but he kept the blade sawing, and suddenly felt the tension vanish as the ravaged hemp unravelled. The rudder squealed on its pintles as Sharpe drew the sabre back through the hole and collapsed in exhaustion against the foot of Fairlie's bed. The Calliope, with no pressure on the rudder to resist her weather helm, swung ponderously into the wind. There were frantic shouts on deck, the sound of bare feet going to the sheets, and then the blessed noise of the sails, slatting and banging as they flapped uselessly in the wind. "Cover the hole!" Fairlie ordered. "Quick, before the buggers see it!" Sharpe moved his feet so they could drop the carpet into place. The ship jerked as the French used the headsails to bring her round. But without the rudder's pressure, she stubbornly went back into irons, and the sails again hammered at the masts. The helmsman would be spinning the wheel that suddenly had no load. And then there was a rush of feet going down the companionways, and Sharpe knew the French were at last exploring the tiller lines. There was a knock on Fairlie's door, and without waiting to be bidden, Lord William entered the cabin. "Does anyone know," he asked, "what precisely is happening?" "We cut the tiller ropes," Fairlie said, "and I'll thank your lordship to keep quiet about it." Lord William blinked at that brusque request, but before he could say anything, there was the sound of a distant gun. "I reckon that's the end of it," Fairlie said happily. "Come on, Sharpe, let's go and see what you wrought." He held out a big hand and hauled Sharpe to his feet. None of the prize crews tried to stop them going on deck. Indeed, the Frenchmen were already hauling down the Calliope's original ensign, which they had hoped would fool their pursuer into thinking that the Indiaman was still under British command. And now they really were under British command, for coming slowly towards the Calliope, and furling her sails as she glided ever nearer, was another great, bluff-sided warship painted yellow and black. Her beakhead was a riot of gilded wood, supporting a figurehead that showed an ecstatic-faced lady graced with a halo, carrying a sword and dressed in silver-painted armour, though her breastplate was curiously truncated to reveal a pinkly naked bosom. "The Pucelle!" Sharpe said in delight. Joan of Arc had come to the rescue of the British, and the Calliope, for the second time in 5 days, was taken. Chapter 6. The first Pucelle crewman to board the Calliope was Captain Joel Chase himself, who scrambled nimbly up the merchantman's side to the cheers of the liberated passengers. The officier marinier, having no sword to surrender, stoically offered Chase a marlinspike instead. Chase grinned, took the spike, then gallantly returned it to the officier marinier, who resignedly led his men into imprisonment below decks, while Chase doffed his hat, shook hands with the passengers on the main deck, and tried to answer a dozen questions all at once. Malachi Braithwaite stood apart from the happy passengers, staring morosely at Sharpe on the quarterdeck. The secretary had been sequestered in steerage ever since the French took the ship, and he must have been suffering pangs of jealousy at the thought of Sharpe being in the stern with Lady Grace. "There's a happy naval captain," Ebenezer Fairlie said. He'd come to stand beside Sharpe on the quarterdeck, and was staring down at the throng of steerage passengers surrounding Chase. "He's just made a fortune in prize money, but mind you, he'll have to fight for it proper now." "What do you mean?" "You think the lawyers won't want their share?" Fairlie asked sourly. "The East India Company will have lawyers saying that the frogs never took the ship properly, so it can't be a prize. And Chase's prize agent will have another set of lawyers arguing the opposite, and between them they'll keep the court busy for years, and make themselves rich and everyone else poor." He sniffed. "I suppose I could hire a lawyer or two myself, seeing as how a deal of the cargo is mine, but I won't bother. Young captain's welcome to the prize so far as I'm concerned. I'd rather he got the cash than some blood-sucking lawyer." Fairlie grimaced.
I once had a good idea on how we could mightily improve the prosperity of Britain, Sharpe. My notion was that every man of property could kill one lawyer a year without fear of penalty. Parliament wasn't interested, but then Parliament's full of bloodsuckers.
Captain Chase extricated himself from the main-deck throng and climbed to the quarter-deck, where the first person he saw was Sharpe.
"My dear Sharpe!"
Chase cried, his face lighting up.
"My dear Sharpe! We're equal now, eh? You rescue me, I rescue you. How are you?"
He clasped Sharpe's hand in both his, was introduced to Fairlie, then glimpsed Lord William Hale.
"Oh, God! I'd forgotten he was on board. How are you, my lord? You're well? Good, good."
In fact, Lord William had not answered the captain, though he was eager to speak with him privately. But Chase spun away and took Tufnell's arm, and the two seamen embarked on a long discussion about how the Calliope had first fallen prey to the Rivernoll. A party of Calliope sailors went below to mend the tiller ropes, while some Pucelle, led by Hopper, the big man who commanded Captain Chase's gig, hoisted a British ensign above the French flag. Lord William, visibly irritated at being ignored by Chase, was waiting to catch the captain's attention, but something Tufnell said caused Chase to ignore his lordship and turn back to the other passengers.
"I want to know everything you can tell me," Chase said urgently, "about the man posing as the Baron von Dornberg's servant."
Most of the passengers looked puzzled. Major Dalton commented that the Baron had been a decent sort of chap, a bit loud-mouthed, but that no one had really remarked on the servant.
"He kept himself to himself," Dalton said.
"He spoke French to me once," Sharpe said.
"He did?"
Chase spun round eagerly.
"Only the once," Sharpe said, "but he spoke English and German too, claimed he was Swiss, but I don't know that he was really a servant at all."
"What do you mean?"
"Well, he was wearing a sword, sir, when he left the ship. Not many servants wear swords." "Hanoverian servants might," Fairlie said. "Foreign folks, strange ways."
"So, what do we know about the Baron?" Chase asked.
"He was a buffoon," Fairlie growled. "He was decent enough," Dalton protested, "and he was generous."
Sharpe could have provided a far more detailed answer, but he was still reluctant to admit that he had deceived the Calliope for so long.
"It's a strange thing, sir," he said instead to Chase, "and I didn't really think about it until after the Baron had left the ship, but he looked just like a fellow called Anthony Pullman." "Did he, Sharpe?" Dalton asked, surprised. "Same build," Sharpe said. "Not that I ever saw Pullman except through a telescope."
Which was not true, but Sharpe had to cover his tracks.
"Who," Chase interrupted, "is Anthony Pullman?" "He's a Hanoverian soldier, sir, who led the Mahratta armies at Assaye." "Sharpe," Chase said seriously, "are you sure?" "Well, it looked like him," Sharpe replied, reddening. "Very like."
"God save me," Chase said in his Devonian accent, then frowned in thought. Lord William approached him again, but Chase distractedly waved his lordship away, and Lord William, already insulted by the captain's disregard, looked even more offended.
"But the main point," Chase went on, "is that von Dornberg and his servant, if he is a servant, are now on the Rivernoll." "Hopper!" "Sir!" the boatswain called from the main deck. "I want all Pucelles back on board fast, but you wait with my barge. Mr. Horrocks, here, please."
Horrocks was the Pucelle's 4th lieutenant, who would command the small prize crew, just 3 men, that Chase would leave aboard the Calliope. The men were not needed to sail the ship, for Tufnell and the Calliope's own seamen could do that, but they were to stay aboard the Indiaman to register Chase's claim on the vessel, which would now sail to Cape Town, where the French prisoners would be given into the care of the British garrison, and the ship could be revictualled for its journey back to Britain and the waiting lawyers. Chase gave Horrocks his orders, stressing that he was to accede to Lieutenant Tufnell in all matters of sailing the Calliope. But he also instructed Horrocks to select 20 of the Calliope's best seamen and press them into the Pucelle. "I don't like doing it," he told Sharpe, "but we're short-handed. Poor fellows won't be happy, but who knows? Some may even volunteer." He didn't sound hopeful. "What about you, Sharpe? Will you sail with us?" "Me, sir? As a passenger," Chase hurriedly explained. "We're going your way, as it happens, and you'll reach England far quicker by sailing with me than staying aboard this scow. Of course you want to come. Clouter!" He called to one of his barge crew in the ship's waist.
You'll bring Mr. Sharpe's dunnage on deck. Lively now, he'll show you where it is.
Sharpe protested. I should stay here, sir, he said. I don't want to be in your way.
Don't have time to discuss it, Sharpe, Chase said happily. Of course you're coming with me.
The captain at last turned to Lord William Hale, who'd been growing ever more angry at Chase's lack of attention. Chase walked away with his lordship, as Clouter, the big black man who had fought so hard on the night Sharpe had first met Chase, climbed to the quarterdeck.
Where do we go, sir?
Clouter asked.
The dunnage will wait for a while,
Sharpe answered. He didn't want to leave the Calliope, not while Lady Grace was aboard, but first he would have to invent some pressing excuse to refuse Chase's invitation. He could think of none offhand, but the thought of abandoning Lady Grace was unbearable. If the worst came to the worst, he decided, he would risk offending Chase by simply refusing to change ships. Chase was now pacing up and down beneath the poop, listening to Lord William, who was doing most of the talking. Chase was nodding, but eventually the captain seemed to shrug resignedly, then turned abruptly to rejoin Sharpe.
Damn, he said bitterly.
Damn and double damn.
You still standing here, Clouter? Go and fetch Mr. Sharpe's dunnage. Nothing too heavy, no pianofortes or four-poster beds.
I told him to wait, Sharpe said.
Chase frowned. You're not going to argue with me, are you, Sharpe? I've quite enough troubles. His bloody lordship claims he needs to reach Britain swiftly, and I couldn't deny that we're on our way into the Atlantic.
The Atlantic? Sharpe asked, astonished.
Of course. I told you I was going your way. And besides, that's where the Revenant is gone. I'll swear on it. I'm even risking my reputation on it. And Lord William tells me he's carrying government dispatches. But is he? I don't know. I think he just wants to be on a larger and safer ship. But I can't refuse him. I'd like to, but I can't. Damn his eyes. You're not listening to this, are you, Clouter? These are words for your superiors and betters. Damn! So now I'm hoisted with bloody Lord William Hale and his bloody wife, their bloody servants and his bloody secretary. Damn!
Clouter, Sharpe said energetically. Lower deck steerage, larboard side. Hurry! He almost sang as he jumped down the stairs. Grace was going with him. Sharpe hid his elation as he made his farewells. He was sorry to part from Ebenezer Fairley, and from Major Dalton, both of whom pressed invitations on him to visit their homes. Mrs. Fairley clasped Sharpe to her considerable bosom, and insisted he took a bottle of brandy and another of rum with him.
"To keep you warm, dear," she said, "and to stop Ebenezer from guzzling them."
A longboat from the Pucelle carried the pressed men away from the Calliope. They were mostly the youngest seamen, and they went to replace those of Chase's crew who had succumbed to disease during the Pucelle's long cruise. They looked morose, for they were exchanging good wages for poor.
"But we'll cheer them up," Chase said airily. "There's nothing like a dose of victory to cheer a tar."
Lord William had insisted that his expensive furniture be taken to the Pucelle, but Chase exploded in anger, saying that his lordship could either travel without furniture or not travel at all. And his lordship had icily given way, though he did convince Chase that his collection of official papers must go with him. Those were all brought from his cabin and taken to the Pucelle. Then Lord William and his wife left the Calliope without making any farewells. Lady Grace looked utterly distraught as she left. She had been weeping, and was now making a huge effort to appear dignified. But she could not help giving Sharpe a despairing glance as she was lowered by a rope and tackle into Chase's barge. Malachi Braithwaite clambered down the Calliope's side after her, and gave Sharpe a venomously triumphant look, as if to suggest that he would now enjoy Lady Grace's company while Sharpe was marooned on the Calliope. Lady Grace gripped the gunwale of the barge with a white-knuckled hand. Then the wind snatched at her hat, lifting its brim. And as she caught the hat, she saw Sharpe swing out of the entry-port and begin to clamber down the ship's side. And, for a heartbeat, an expression of pure joy showed on her face. Braithwaite, seeing Sharpe come down the ladder, gaped in astonishment, and looked as though he wanted to protest, but his mouth just opened and closed like a gaffed fish.
"Make space, Braithwaite," Sharpe said. "I'm keeping you company." "Goodbye, Sharpe. Write to me," Dalton called. "Good luck, lad," Fairley boomed.
Chase descended the ladder last and took his place in the stern sheets.
"All together now!"
Hopper shouted, and the oarsmen dug in their red and white blades, and the barge slid away from the calliope. The stench of the Pucelle reached across the water. It was the smell of a huge crew crammed into a wooden ship, the stink of unwashed bodies, of body waste, of tobacco, tar, salt, and rot. But the ship herself loomed high and mighty, a great sheer wall of gunports crammed with men, powder, and shot. "Goodbye!" Dalton called a last time, and Sharpe joined the hunter, seeking revenge, going home.
"I hate having women on board," Chase said savagely. "It's bad luck, you know that? Women and rabbits both bring bad luck."
He touched the polished table in his day cabin to avert the ill fortune.
"Not that there aren't women on board already," he admitted. "There's at least 6 Portsmouth whores down below who I'm not supposed to know about, and I suspect one of the gunners has his wife hidden away, but that ain't the same as having her ladyship and her maid out on the open deck feeding the crew's filthy fantasies."
Sharpe said nothing. The elegant cabin stretched the whole width of the ship, and was lit by a wide stern window through which he could see the far-off calliope already hull down on the horizon. The windows were curtained in flowered chintz, which matched the cushions spread along the window-seat, and the deck was carpeted with canvas painted in a black and white checkerboard pattern. There were 2 tables, a sideboard, a deep leather armchair, a couch, and a revolving bookcase, though the air of genteel domesticity was somewhat spoiled by the presence of 2 18-pounder cannons that pointed towards red-painted gunports. Forward of the day cabin, and on the ship's starboard side, were Chase's sleeping quarters, while forward on the larboard side was a dining cabin that could seat a dozen in comfort.
"And I'll be damned if I'll move out for Lord Goddamn Bloody Hale," Chase grumbled, "though he plainly expects me to. He can go back to the first lieutenant's quarters, and his damn wife can go into the second lieutenant's cabin, which is how they sail from Calcutta. Lord knows why they sleep apart, but they do. Shouldn't have told you that."
"I didn't hear it," Sharpe said.
"The bloody secretary can go in Horrocks' cabin," Chase decided.
Horrocks was the lieutenant who'd been made prize-master of the Calliope.
"And the first lieutenant can have the master's cabin. He died 3 days ago. No one knows why. He tired of life, or life tired of him. God alone knows where the second will go. He'll turf out the third, I suppose. He'll kick out someone else, and so on down to the ship's cat. It'll get chucked overboard, poor thing. God, I hate having passengers, especially women. You'll have my quarters."
"Your quarters?" Sharpe asked in astonishment.
"Sleeping cabin," Chase said. "Through that door there." "Good Lord above, Sharpe, I've got this damn great room."
He gestured about the lavish day cabin with its elegant furniture, framed portraits, and curtained windows.
"My steward can hang my cot in here, and yours can go in the small cabin." I can't take your cabin," Sharpe protested. "Of course you can. It's a damn poky little hole anyway. Just right for an insignificant ensign. Besides, Sharpe, I'm a fellow who likes some company, and as captain I can't go to the wardroom without an invitation, and the officers don't invite me much. Can't blame them. They want to relax, so I end up in lonely state. So you can entertain me instead. Do you play chess? No? I shall teach you. And you'll take supper with me tonight? Of course you will."
Chase, who had taken off his uniform coat, stretched out in a chair.
"Do you really think the Baron might have been Pullman?"
"He was," Sharpe said flatly. Chase raised an eyebrow.
"So sure?"
"I recognized him, sir," Sharpe admitted. "But I didn't tell any of the Calliope's officers. I didn't think it was important." Chase shook his head, more in amusement than disapproval.
"Well, it wouldn't have done any good if you had told them, and Peculiar would probably have killed you if you had. And as for the others, how were they to know what was happening? I only hope to God I do."
He straightened to find a piece of paper on the larger table.
"We, that is His Britannic Majesty's Navy, are looking for a gentleman named Vaillard, Michel Vaillard. He's a bad lad, our Vaillard, and it seems he's trying to return to Europe. And how better to travel in disguise as a servant? No one looks at servants, do they?"
"Why are you searching for him, sir?"
"It seems, Sharpe, that he's been negotiating with the last of the Marathas, who are terrified that the British will take over what's left of their territory. So Vaillard has concluded a treaty with one of their leaders, Holkar."
He looked at the paper.
"Yes, Holkar, and Vaillard is taking the treaty back to Paris. Holkar agrees to talk peace with the British, and in the meantime Monsieur Vaillard, presumably with the help of your friend Pullman, arranges to supply Holkar with French advisers, French cannon, and French muskets. This is a copy of the treaty." He flicked the paper over to Sharpe, who saw that it was in French, though someone had helpfully written a translation between the lines. Holkar, the ablest of the Maratha war leaders, and a man who had evaded the army of Sir Arthur Wellesley, but who was now being pressed by other British forces, had undertaken to open peace negotiations, and, under their cover, raise an enormous army which would be equipped by his allies, the French. The treaty even listed those princes in British territory who could be relied on to rebel if such an army attacked out of the north. "They've been clever, Vaillant and Pullman," Chase said. "Used British ships to go home. Quickest way, you see. They suborned your fellow Cromwell, and must have sent a message to Mauritius arranging a rendezvous." "How did we get a copy of their treaty?" Sharpe said. "Spies?" Chase guessed. "Everything became vigorous after you left Bombay. The Admiral sent a sloop to the Red Sea in case Vaillant decided to go overland, and he sent a Porcupine to overhaul the convoy, and told me to keep my eyes skinned as well, because stopping that damn Vaillant is our most important job. Now we know where the bloody man is, or think we do, so I'll have to pursue him. They're going back to Europe, and we are too. It's back home for us, Sharpe, and you're going to see just how fast a French-built warship can sail. The trouble is that the Revenant's just as quick, and she's the best part of a week in front of us." "And if you catch her?" "We beat it to smithereens, of course," Chase said happily, "and make certain Monsieur Vaillant and Herr Pullman go to the fishes." "And Captain Cromwell with them," Sharpe said vengefully. "I think I'd rather take him alive," Chase said, "and hang him from the yardarm. Nothing cheers up a jack-tar's spirit so much as seeing a captain swinging on a generous length of Bridport hemp." Sharpe looked through the stern window to see the Calliope was just a smudge of sails on the horizon. He felt like a cask thrown into a fast river, being swept away to some unknown destination on a journey over which he had no control. But he was glad it was happening, for he was still with Lady Grace. The very thought of her sparked a warm feeling in his breast, though he knew it was a madness, an utter madness, but he could not escape it. He didn't even want to escape it. "Here's Mr. Harold Collier," Chase said, responding to a knock on the door that brought into the cabin the diminutive midshipman who commanded the boat that had carried Sharpe out to the Calliope so long ago in Bombay harbour. Now Mr. Collier was ordered to show Sharpe the Pucelle. The boy was touchingly proud of his ship, while Sharpe was awed by it. It was a vast thing, much bigger than the Calliope, and young Harry Collier rattled off its statistics as he took Sharpe through the lavish dining cabin where another 18-pounder squatted. "She's 178 feet long, sir, not counting our bowsprit, of course, and 48 in the beam, sir, and 175 feet to the main truck, which is the very top of the mainmast, sir. Mind your head, sir. She was French-built out of 2,000 oak trees, and she weighs close to 2,000 tons, sir. Mind your head. And she's got 74 guns, sir, not counting the carronades, of course, and we've 6 of them, all 32-pounders. And there's 617 men aboard, sir, not counting the Marines." "How many of those?" 66, sir. This way, sir. Mind your head, sir." Collier led Sharpe onto the quarter-deck, where 8 long guns lay behind their closed ports. 18-pounders, sir," Collier squeaked. "The babies on the ship, just 6 aside, sir, including the 4 in the stern quarters." He slithered down a perilously steep companionway to the main deck. "This is the weather deck, sir. 32 guns, sir, all 24-pounders. The centre of the main deck, or weather deck, was open to the sky, but the forward and aft sections of the deck were planked over where the forecastle and quarter-deck were built. Collier led Sharpe forward, weaving nimbly between the huge guns and the mess tables rigged between them, ducking under hammocks where men of the off-duty watch slept, then swerving around the anchor capstan and down another ladder into the Stygian darkness of the lower deck, which held the ship's biggest guns, each throwing a ball of 32 pounds. 30 of these big guns, sir," he said proudly. "Mind your head, sir. 15 aside, and we're lucky to have so many. There's a shortage of these big guns, they tell us, and some ships are even driven to put 18-pounders on their lower deck, but not Captain Chase. He wouldn't abide that. Oh, I told you to mind your head, sir." Sharpe rubbed the bruise on his forehead and tried to work out the weight of shot that the Pucelle could fire, but Collier was ahead of him. We can throw 972 pounds of metal with each broadside, sir, and we've got 2 sides," he added helpfully, "as you may have noticed. And we've got the 6 carronades, sir, and they can throw 32 pounds apiece, plus a cask of musket balls as well. We shall make a Frenchman weep, sir. Or so I'm told, sir. Mind your head, sir." Which meant, Sharpe thought, that this one ship could throw more round shot in a single broadside than all the combined batteries of the army's artillery at the Battle of Versailles. It was a floating bastion, a crushing killer of the high seas, and this wasn't even the largest warship afloat. Some ships, Sharpe knew, carried over 100 guns, and again Collier had the answers, trained in them, because, like all midshipmen, he was preparing for his lieutenant's examination. "The Navy's got 8 first-rates, sir. That's ships with 100 or more guns. Watch that low beam, sir. 14 second-rates, which carry about 90 or more cannon, and 130 of these third-rates." "You call this a third rate?" Sharpe asked, astonished. "Down here, sir. Watch your head, sir." Collier vanished into another companionway, sliding down the ladder's uprights, and Sharpe followed more slowly, using the rungs, to find himself in a dark, dank, low-ceilinged deck that stank foully and was dimly lit by a scatter of glass-shielded lanterns. "This is the orlop deck, sir. Mind your head. It's called the cockpit as well, sir. Watch that beam, sir. We're just about under water here, sir, and the surgeon has his rooms down there beyond the magazines. And we all pray, sir, we never end under his knife. This way, sir. Mind your head!" He showed Sharpe the cable tires where the anchor ropes were flaked down, the 2 leather-curtained magazines that were guarded by red-coated marines, the spirit store, the surgeon's lair where the walls were painted red so that the blood didn't show, the dispensary, and the midshipmen's cabins that were scarce bigger than dog kennels. Then he took Sharpe down a final ladder into the massive hold, where the ship's stores were piled in vast heaps of casks. Only the bilge lay beneath, and a mournful sucking, interrupted by a clatter, told Sharpe the men were even now pumping it dry. "We hardly ever stop the 6 pumps," the midshipman said, "because as tight as you build them, sir, the sea do get in." He kicked at a rat, missed, then scrambled back up the ladder. He showed Sharpe the galley beneath the forecastle, introduced him to master-at-arms, cooks, boatswains, gunners' mates, the carpenter, then offered to take Sharpe up the mainmast. "I'll not bother today," Sharpe said. Collier took him to the wardroom, where he was named to a half-dozen officers, then back to the quarter-deck and aft, past the great double wheel, to a door that led directly into Captain Chase's sleeping cabin. It was, as the captain had said, a small room, but it was panelled with varnished wood, had a canvas carpet on the floor, and a scuttle to let in the daylight. Sharpe's sea-chest took up one wall, and Collier now helped him rig the hanging cot. "If you're killed, sir," the boy said earnestly, "then this will be your coffin." "Better than the one the army would give me," Sharpe said, throwing his blankets into the cot. "Where's the first lieutenant's cabin?" he asked. "Forward of this one, sir." Collier indicated the forward bulkhead. "Just beyond there, sir." "And the second lieutenant's?" Sharpe asked, knowing that was where Lady Grace would be sleeping. "Weatherdeck, sir. Aft, by the wardroom," Collier said. "There's a hook for your lantern there, sir, and you'll find the captain's quarter-gallery is aft through that door, sir, and on the starboard side." "Quarter-gallery?" Sharpe asked. "Latrine, sir. Drops direct into the sea, sir. Very hygienic. Captain Chase says you're to share it, sir, and his steward will look after you, you being his guest." "You like Chase?" Sharpe asked, struck by the warmth in the midshipman's voice. "Well, everyone likes a captain, sir, everyone," Collier said. "This is a happy ship, sir, which is more than I can say for many, and permit me to remind you that Captain's supper is at the end of the first dog watch. That's 4 bells, sir, seeing as how the dog watches are only 2 hours apiece." "What is it now?" "Just past 2 bells, sir." "So how long till 4 bells?" Collier's small face showed astonishment that anyone should need to ask such a question. "An hour, sir, of course." "Oh, of course," Sharpe said. Chase had invited 6 other guests to join him for supper. He could hardly avoid asking Lord William Hale and his wife, and he confided in Sharpe that Haskell, the first lieutenant, was a terrible snob, who had flattered Lord William all the way from Calcutta to Bombay. "So we can damn well do it again now," Chase said, glancing at his first lieutenant, a tall, good-looking man who was bending close to Lord William and evidently drinking in every word. "And this is Llewellyn, Chase said, drawing Sharpe towards a red-faced man in a scarlet uniform coat. "A man who does nothing by halves, and is a captain of our marines, which means that if the frogs board us, I'm relying on Llewellyn and his rogues to throw them overboard. Is your name really Llewellyn? We are descended from the lineage of ancient kings, Captain Llewellyn said proudly. Unlike the Chase family, which, unless I'm very much mistaken, were mere servants of the hunt. We hunted the bloody Welsh out, Chase said, smiling. It was plain that the two were old friends who took a delight in mutual insult. This is my particular friend, Llewellyn, Richard Sharpe. The Marine captain shook Sharpe's hand energetically and expressed the hope that the ensign would join him and his men for some musketry training. Maybe you can teach us something, the captain suggested. I doubt it, Captain. I could use your help, Llewellyn said enthusiastically. I've a lieutenant, of course, but the lad's only 16, doesn't even shave. Not sure he can wipe his own bum. It's good to have another redcoat aboard, Sharpe. It raises the tone of the ship. Chase laughed, then drew Sharpe on to meet the last guest, the ship's surgeon, who was a plump man called Pickering. Malachi Braithwaite had been talking to the surgeon, and he looked uncomfortable as Sharpe was introduced. Pickering, whose face was a mass of broken blood vessels, shook Sharpe's hand. I trust we never meet professionally, Ensign, for there ain't a great deal I can do except carve you up and mutter a prayer. I do the latter very prettily, if that's a consolation. I say, she does look better. The surgeon had turned to look at Lady Grace, who was in a low-cut dress of very pale blue with an embroidered collar and hem. There were diamonds at her throat, and more diamonds in her black hair, which was pinned so high that it brushed the beams of Chase's cabin whenever she moved. I hardly saw her when she was aboard before, Pickering said, but she seems a good deal more lively now. Even so, she's unwelcome. Unwelcome? Sharpe asked. Monstrous ill luck to have women on board. Monstrous ill luck. Pickering reached up and superstitiously touched a beam. But I must say she's decorative. There'll be some odious things being said in the forecastle tonight, I can tell you. Ah, well, we must survive what the good Lord sends us, even if it is a woman. Our captain tells us you're a celebrated soldier, Sharpe. He does? Sharpe asked. Braithwaite had stepped back, signifying he wanted no part in the conversation. Burst into the breach and all that sort of stuff, Pickering said. As for me, my dear fellow, as soon as the guns begin to sound, I scamper down to the cockpit, where no French shot can reach me. You know what the trick of a long life is, Sharpe. Stay out of range. There. Good medical advice, and free. The food at Captain Chase's table was a great deal better than that which Peculiar Cromwell had supplied. They began with sliced smoked fish, served with lemon and real bread, then ate a roast of mutton which Sharpe suspected was goat, but which nevertheless tasted wonderful in its vinegar sauce, and finished with a concoction of oranges, brandy, and syrup. Lord William and Lady Grace sat either side of Chase, while the first lieutenant sat next to her ladyship and tried to persuade her to drink more wine than she wished. The red wine was called Blackstrap and was sour, while the insipid white was called Miss Taylor, a name that puzzled Sharpe until he saw the label on one of the bottles, Miss Taylor. Sharpe was at the far end of the table, where Captain Llewellyn questioned him closely about the actions he'd seen in India. The Welshman was intrigued by the news that Sharpe was going to join the 95th Rifles. The concept of a rifle barrel might work on land, Llewellyn said, but it'll never serve at sea. Why not? Accuracy's no good on a ship. The things are always heaving up and down to spoil your aim. No, the thing to do is to pour a lot of fire onto the enemy's deck and pray not all of it is wasted. Which reminds me, we've got some new toys aboard, 7-barrel guns, monstrous things. They spit out 7.5-inch balls at once. You must try one. Well, I'd like that. I'd like to see some 7-barrel guns in the fighting tops, Llewellyn said eagerly. They could do some real damage, Sharpe, real damage. Chase had overheard Llewellyn's last remark, for he intervened from the table's far end. Nelson won't allow muskets in the fighting tops, Llewellyn. He says they set the sails on fire. The man's wrong, Llewellyn said, offended. Just plain wrong. You know Lord Nelson? Lady Grace asked the captain. I served under him briefly, my lady, Chase said enthusiastically. Too briefly. I had a frigate then, but, alas, I never saw action under his lordship's command. I pray God we see no action now, Lord William said piously. Amen, Braithwaite said, breaking his silence. He'd spent most of the meal gazing dumbly at Lady Grace and flinching whenever Sharpe spoke. By God, I hope we do see action, Chase retorted. We have to stop our German friend and his so-called servant. "Do you think you can catch the Revenant?" Lady Grace asked. "I hope so, my lady, but it'll be touch and go. He's a good seaman, Montmorin, and the Revenant's a quick ship, but her bottom will be a deal more foul than ours." "It looked clean to me," Sharpe said. "Clean?" Chase sounded alarmed. "No green copper at the waterline, sir. All bright." "Wretched man," Chase said, meaning Montmorin. "He's scrubbed his hull, hasn't he? Which will make him harder to catch. And I made a wager with Mr. Haskell that we'd meet with him on my birthday." "And when's that?" Lady Grace asked. "October 21st, ma'am, and by my reckoning we should be somewhere off Portugal by then." "She won't be off Portugal," the First Lieutenant suggested, "for she won't be sailing direct to France. She'll put into Cadiz, sir, and my guess is we'll catch her during the second week in October, somewhere off Africa." "10 guineas rides on the result," Chase said, "and I know I've forsworn gambling, but I shall happily pay you so long as we do catch her. Then we'll have a rare fight, my lady, but let me assure you that you'll be safe below the waterline." Lady Grace smiled. "I'm to miss all the entertainment aboard, Captain?" That brought laughter. Sharpe had never seen her ladyship so relaxed in company. The candles glinted off her diamond earrings and necklace, from the jewels on her fingers and from her bright eyes. Her vivacity was captivating the whole table, all except for her husband, who wore a slight frown as though he feared his wife had drunk too much of the Blackstrap or the Miss Taylor. Sharpe was assailed with the jealous thought that perhaps she was responding to the handsome and genial Chase. But just as he felt that envy, she glanced down the table and briefly caught his eye. Braithwaite saw it and stared down at his plate. "I've never entirely understood," Lord William said, breaking the moment's mood, "why you fellows insist on taking your ships up close to the enemy and battering their hulls. Easier surely to stand off and destroy their rigging from a distance." "That's the French way, my lord," Chase said. "Bar shot, chain shot, and round shot. Fire on the uproll and intended to take out our sticks. But once they've dismasted us, once we're lying like a log in the water, they still have to take us." "But if they have masts and sails, and you do not," Lord William pointed out, "why can they not just pour their broadsides into your stern?" "You assume, my lord, that while our notional Frenchman is trying to unmast us, we're doing nothing." Chase smiled to soften his words. "A ship of the line, my lord, is nothing more than a floating artillery battery. Destroy the sails, and you still have a gun battery. But dismount the cannons, splinter its decks, and kill the gunners, and you've denied the ship its very purpose of existence. The French try to give us a long-range haircut, while we get up close and mangle their vitals." He turned to Lady Grace. "This must be tiresome, my lady, men talking of battle." "I've become used to it these past weeks," Grace said. "There was a Scottish major on the Calliope who was ever trying to persuade Mr. Sharpe to tell us such tales." She turned to Sharpe. "You never did tell us, Mr. Sharpe, what happened when you saved my cousin's life." "My wife has become excessively interested in one of her remoter cousins," Lord William interrupted, "ever since he gained some small notoriety in India. Extraordinary how a dull fellow like Wellesley can rise in the army, isn't it?" "You saved Wellesley's life, Sharpe?" Chase asked, ignoring his lordship's sarcasm. "Well, I don't know about that, sir. I probably just kept him from being captured." "Is that how you got that scar?" Llewellyn asked. "That was at Gavelgo, sir." Sharpe wished the conversation would veer away to another subject, and he tried desperately to think of something to say which might steer it in a new direction, but his mind was floundering. "So what happened?" Chase demanded. "He was unhorsed, sir," Sharpe said, reddening, "in the enemy ranks." "He was not by himself, surely?" Lord William asked. "He was, sir, except for me, of course." "Careless of him?" Lord William suggested. "And how many enemy?" Chase asked. "A good few, sir." "And you fought them off?" Sharpe nodded. "I didn't have much choice, really, sir." "Stay out of range," the surgeon boomed. "That's my advice. Stay out of range." Lord William complimented Captain Chase on the concoction of oranges, and Chase boasted of his cook and steward, and that started a general discussion on the problem of reliable servants that only ended when Sharpe, as the junior officer present, was asked to give the loyal toast. "To King George," Sharpe said. "God bless him." "And damn his enemies," Chase added, tossing back the glass. "Especially Monsieur Vaillard."
Lady Grace pushed her chair back. Captain Chase tried to stop her retiring, saying that she was most welcome to breathe the cigar smoke that was about to fill the cabin, but she insisted on leaving, and so the whole table stood. "You will not object, Captain, if I walk on your deck for a while?" Lady Grace asked. "I should be delighted to have it so honoured, my lady." Brandy and cigars were produced, but the company did not stay long. Lord William suggested a hand of whist, but Chase had lost too much on his first voyage with his lordship, and explained he'd decided to give up playing cards altogether. Lieutenant Haskell promised a lively game in the wardroom, and Lord William and the others followed him down to the weather deck and then aft. Chase bade his visitors a good night, then invited Sharpe into the day cabin at the stern. "One last brandy, Sharpe. I don't want to keep you up, sir. I'll turf you out when I'm tired. Here." He gave Sharpe a glass, then led the way into the more comfortable day cabin. "Lord, but that William Hale is a bore," he said, "though I confess I was surprised by his wife. Never seen her so lively. Last time she was aboard I thought she was going to wilt and die." "Maybe it was the wine tonight," Sharpe suggested. "Maybe, but I hear tales." "Tales?" Sharpe asked warily. "That you not only rescued her cousin, but that you rescued her, to the detriment of one French lieutenant, who now sleeps with his ancestors." Sharpe nodded, but said nothing. Chase smiled. "She seems the better for the experience. And that secretary of his is a gloomy bird, isn't he? Scarce a damn word all night, and he's an Oxford man." To Sharpe's relief, Chase left the subject of Lady Grace, and instead inquired whether Sharpe would consider putting himself under Captain Llewellyn's command, and so become an honorary marine. "If we do catch the Revenant," Chase said, "we'll be trying to capture her. You might hammer her into submission." He put out a hand and surreptitiously touched the table. "But we might still have to board her. We'll need fighting men if that happens. So, can I count on your help?" "Good. I'll tell Llewellyn that you're now his man. He's a thoroughly first-rate fellow, despite being a marine and a Welshman, and I doubt he'll pester you overmuch. Now, I must go on deck and make certain they're not steering in circles. You'll come?" "I will, sir." So Sharpe was now an honorary marine. The Pucelle used every sail that Chase could cram onto her masts. He even rigged extra hawsers to stay the masts, so that yet more canvas could be carried aloft and hung from spars that jutted out from the yards. There were studding sails and skyscrapers, staysails, royals, spritsails and topsails, a cloud of canvas that drove the warship westwards. Chase called it hanging out his laundry, and Sharpe saw how the crew responded to their captain's enthusiasm. They were as eager as Chase to prove the Pucelle the fastest sailor on the sea. And so they flew westwards, until, deep in a dark night, the sea became lumpy, and the ship rolled like a drunk, and Sharpe was woken by the rush of feet on the deck. The cot, in which he was alone, swung wildly, and he fell hard when he rolled out of it. He didn't bother to dress, but just put on a boat cloak that Chase had lent him, then let himself out of the door onto the quarter-deck, where he could see almost nothing, for clouds were obscuring the moon. Yet he could hear orders being bellowed, and hear the voices of men high in the rigging above him. Sharpe still didn't understand how men could work in the dark, 100 feet above a pitching deck, clinging to thin lines, and hearing the wind shriek in their ears. It was a bravery, he reckoned, as great as any that was needed on a battlefield. "Is that you, Sharpe?" Chase's voice called. "Yes, sir." "It's the Agulhas current," Chase said happily, "sweeping us round the tip of Africa. We're shortening sail. It'll be rough for a day or two." Daylight revealed broken seas being whipped ragged white by the wind. The Pucelle pitched into the steep waves, sometimes shattering them into clouds of drenching spray that rose above the foresail and rained down in streams from the canvas. Yet still Chase pushed his ship, and drove her, and talked to her. He still gave suppers in his quarters, for he enjoyed company in the evening. But any shift of wind would drive him from the table onto the quarter-deck. He watched each cast of the log eagerly, and jotted down the ship's speed, and rejoiced when, as the African coast curved westwards, he was able to hoist his full laundry again, and feel the long hull respond to the wind's force. "I think we'll catch her," he told Sharpe one day. "She can't be going this fast," Sharpe guessed. "Oh, she probably is, but my guess is that Montmorin won't have dared go too close to land. He'll have been forced far to the south in case he was spotted by our ships out of Cape Town.
so we're cutting the corner on him. Who knows? We may be only a score or so of miles behind him."
The Pucelle was seeing other ships now. Most were small native trading vessels, but they also passed 2 British merchantmen, an American whaler, and a Royal Navy sloop with which there was a brisk exchange of signals. Connors, the 3rd lieutenant who had the responsibility of looking after the ship's signals, ordered a man to haul a string of brightly coloured flags up into the rigging, then put a telescope to his eye and called out the sloop's answering message. "She's the Hirondelle, sir, out of Cape Town. Ask if she's seen any other ships of the line." The flags were found, sorted and hoisted, and the answer came back, no. Chase then sent a long message telling the Hirondelle's captain that the Pucelle was pursuing the Rivenant into the Atlantic. In time, that news would reach the Admiral in Bombay, who must already have been wondering what had happened to his precious 74. Land was spotted the next day, but it was distant and obscured by a squall of rain that rattled on the sails and bounced from the decks, which were scrubbed clean every morning by grinding sand into the timber beneath blocks of stone the size of Bibles. Holy stoning, the men called it. Still the Pucelle drove on, with every last scrap of canvas hoisted, sailing as though the devil himself was on her tail. The wind stayed strong, but for long days it brought stinging rain, so that everything below deck became damp and greasy. Then, on another day of driving rain and gusting wind, they passed Cape Town, though Sharpe could see nothing of the place except a misty glimpse of a great flat-topped mountain half shrouded in cloud. Captain Chase ordered new charts spread on the big table in his day cabin. "I have a choice now," he told Sharpe. "Either I head west into the Atlantic, or ride the current up the African coast until we find the southeast trades." The choice seemed obvious to Sharpe. Ride the current, but he was no sailor. "I take a risk," Chase explained, "if I stay inshore. I get the land breezes, and I have the current, but I also risk fog, and I might get a westerly gale. Then we're on a lee shore." "And a lee shore means?" Sharpe asked. "We're dead," Chase said shortly, and let the chart roll itself up with a snap. "Which is why the sailing directions insist we go west," he added. "But if we do, then we risk being becalmed." "Where do you think the Revenant is?" "She's out west. She's avoiding land. At least, I hope she is." Chase stared out of the stern window at the white-fretted wake. He looked tired now, and older, because his natural ebullience had been drained from him by days and nights of broken sleep and unbroken worry. "Maybe she stayed inshore," he mused. "She could have hoisted false colours. But the Hirondelle didn't see her. Mind you, in these damn squalls, a fleet could go within a couple of miles of us, and we wouldn't see a thing." He pulled on his tarpaulin coat, ready to go back on deck. "Up the coast, I think." He spoke to himself. "Up the coast, and God help us if there's a blowout at the west." He picked up his hat. "God help us anyway if we don't find the Revenant. Their lordships of the Admiralty don't look mercifully on captains who abandon their station to chase wild geese halfway round the world. And God help us if we do find it, and that fellow really is a Swiss servant, and not Vaillard after all. And the first lieutenant's right. He won't be sailing to France, but making for Cadiz. It's closer, much closer." He shrugged. "I'm sorry, Sharpe. I'm not very good company for you. I'm having a better time than I ever dared expect when I embarked on the Calliope." "Good," Chase said, going to the door. "Good. And time to turn north." Sharpe was busy enough. In the morning he paraded with the Marines, and then there was practice. Endless practice, for Captain Llewellyn feared his men would become stale if they were not busy. They fired their muskets in all weathers, learning how to shield their locks from the rain. They fired from the decks and from the upper works, and Sharpe fired with them, using one of the sea service muskets, which was similar to the weapon he'd fired when he was a private, but with a slightly shorter barrel and an old-fashioned flatlock which looked crude, but, as Llewellyn explained, was easier to repair at sea. The weapons were susceptible to salt air, and the Marines spent hours cleaning and oiling the guns, and more hours practicing with bayonets and cutlasses. Llewellyn also insisted that Sharpe try his new toys, the 7-barrel guns, and so Sharpe fired one into the sea from the forecastle, and thought his shoulder must be broken, so violent was the kick of the 7 half-inch barrels. it took over 2 minutes to reload, but the marine captain would not see that as a disadvantage. "Fire one of those down onto a frog deck, Sharpe, and we're making some proper misery." Most of all, Llewellyn wanted to board the Revenant, and could not wait to launch his red-coated men onto the enemy's deck. "Which is why the men have to stay spry, Sharpe," he would say. Then he would order groups to race from the forecastle to the quarter-deck, back to the forecastle, then up the forward mast by the larboard ratlines and down by the starboard ones. "If the frogs board us," he said, "we have to be able to get round the ship quickly. Don't dawdle, Hawkins! Hurry, man, hurry! You're a marine, not a slug!" Sharpe equipped himself with a cutlass that suited him far better than the cavalry sabre he had worn ever since the Battle of Versailles. The cutlass was straight-bladed, heavy and crude, but it felt like a weapon that could do serious damage. "You don't fence with them," Llewellyn advised him, "because it ain't a weapon for the wrist, it's a full-arm blade. Hack the buggers down. Keep your arms strong, Sharpe, eh? Climb the masts every day. Do the cutlass drill. Keep strong." Sharpe did climb the masts. He found it terrifying, for every small motion on deck was magnified as he went higher. At first he didn't try to reach the topmost parts of the rigging, but he became adept at clambering up to the maintop, which was a wide platform built where the lower mast was joined to the upper. The sailors reached the maintop by using the Flutter Shrouds, which led to the platform's outer edge, but Sharpe always wriggled through the small hatchway beside the mast, rather than risk the frightening climb up the Flutter Shrouds, where a man must hang upside down from the tarred ropes. Then, a week after they had turned north, on a day when the sea was frustratingly calm and the wind fitful, Sharpe decided to attempt the Flutter Shrouds, and so show that a soldier could do what any midshipman made look simple. He climbed the lower ratlines, which were easy, for they leaned like a ladder against the mast, but then he came to the place where the Flutter Shrouds went out and backwards above his head. He would have to climb upside down, but he was determined to do it, and so he reached back with his hands and hauled himself upwards. Then, halfway to the maintop's platform, his feet slipped off the ratlines, and he hung there, suspended 50 feet above the deck, and he felt his fingers, hooked like claws, slipping on the wet ropes, and he dared not swing his legs for fear of falling. And so he stayed, paralyzed by fear, until a topman, swinging down through the web of rigging with the agility of a monkey, grabbed his waistband and hauled him into the maintop. "Lord, sir, you don't want to be going that away. That'll be for matlows, not lobsters. Use the lubbers, old sir. That's what it be for, lubbers." Sharpe was still too scared to speak. All he could think of was the sensation of his fingers slipping over the rough tarred rope. But at last he managed to gasp a thank you, and promised to reward the man with a pound of tobacco from his stores. "Almost lost you there, Sharpe," Chase said cheerfully when Sharpe regained the quarter-deck. "Terrifying," Sharpe said, and looked at his hands that were scored deep with tar. Lady Grace had also seen his near fall. She had not been near Sharpe now for the best part of a week, and her distance worried him. She had exchanged glances with him once or twice, and those swift looks had seemed to be filled with a mute appeal. But there'd been no chance to talk with her, and she hadn't risked coming to his cabin in the heart of the night. Now she was standing on the lee side of the quarter-deck, close to her husband, who was speaking with Malachi Braithwaite, and she seemed to hesitate before approaching Sharpe. But then, with a visible effort, she made herself cross the deck. Malachi Braithwaite watched her, while her husband frowned at a sheaf of papers. "We make slow progress today, Captain Chase," she said stiffly. "We have a current, my lady, which invisibly helps us, but I do wish the wind would pipe up." Chase frowned at the sails. "Some folk believe whistling encourages the wind, but it never seems to work." He whistled 2 bars of Nancy Dawson, but the wind stayed light. "See?" Lady Grace stared at Chase, apparently at a loss for words, and the captain suddenly sensed that she was in some distress. "My lady?" he inquired with a concerned frown. "You could perhaps show me on a chart where we are, Captain," she blurted out. Chase hesitated, confused by the sudden request. "It'll be a pleasure, my lady," he said. "The charts are in my day cabin. Will his lordship—" "I shall be quite safe in your cabin, Captain," Lady Grace said. "The ship's yours, Mr. Peel," Chase said to the second lieutenant, then led Lady Grace under the break of the poop to the door on the larboard side which led into the dining cabin. Lord William saw them and frowned, making Chase pause. "You wish to see the charts, my lord?" the captain asked. "No, no," Lord William said, and returned to the papers. Braithwaite watched Sharpe, and Sharpe knew he mustn't arouse the secretary's suspicions. But he didn't believe Lady Grace truly wanted to see the charts, and so, ignoring Braithwaite's hostile gaze, he went to his sleeping cabin, which lay beyond the starboard door under the poop deck. He knocked on the farther door, which led from the sleeping cabin into the day cabin, but there was no answer, and so he let himself into the big stern cabin. "Sharpe!" Chase showed a small flash of irritation, for, friendly as he was, his quarters were sacrosanct, and he had not responded to the knock on the door. "The captain," Lady Grace said, laying a hand on his arm. "Please." Chase, who'd been unrolling a chart, looked from her to Sharpe, and from Sharpe back to Lady Grace again. He let the chart roll up with a snap. "I clean forgot to wind the chronometers this morning," he said. "Would you forgive me?" He went past Sharpe into the dining cabin, ostentatiously closing the door with a deliberately loud click. "Oh, God, Richard!" Lady Grace ran to him and hugged him. "Oh, God!" "What's the matter?" For a few seconds she didn't speak, but then realized she had little time if tongues were not to wag about herself and the captain. "It's my husband's secretary," she said. "I know all about him." "You do?" She stared at him wide-eyed. "He's blackmailing you?" Sharpe guessed. She nodded. "And he watches me." Sharpe kissed her. "Leave him to me. Now go, before anyone starts a rumour." She kissed him fiercely, then went back onto the deck scarce 2 minutes after she had left it. Sharpe waited until Chase, who had wound his chronometers at dawn, as he always did, came back to the day cabin. Chase rubbed his face tiredly, then looked at Sharpe. "Well, I never," he said, then sat in his deep armchair. "It's called playing with fire, Sharpe." "I know, sir." Sharpe was blushing. "Not that I blame you," Chase said. "Good Lord, don't think that. I was a dog myself until I met Florence, a dear woman. A good marriage tends a man to steadiness, Sharpe." "Is that advice, sir?" "No," Chase smiled. "It's a boast." He paused, thinking now of his ship rather than of Sharpe and Lady Grace. "This thing isn't going to explode, is it?" "No," Sharpe said. "It's just that ships are oddly fragile, Sharpe. You can have the people content and working hard, but it doesn't take much to start dissent and rancour." "It won't explode, sir." "Of course not. You said so." "Well, dear me, you do surprise me. Or maybe you don't. She's a beauty, I'll say that, and he's a very cold fish. I think if I wasn't so securely married, I'd be envious of you. Positively envious." "We're just acquaintances," Sharpe said. "Of course you are, my dear fellow, of course you are." Chase smiled. "But her husband might be affronted by a mere—" He paused. "Acquaintanceship." "I think that's safe to say, sir." "Then make sure nothing happens to him, for he's my responsibility." Chase spoke those words in a harsh voice, then smiled. "Other than that, Richard, enjoy yourself, but quietly, I beg you, quietly." Chase said the last few words in a whisper, then stood and went back to the quarterdeck. Sharpe waited a half-hour before leaving the stern quarters, doing his best to allay any suspicions that Braithwaite must inevitably have, but the secretary had left the quarterdeck by the time Sharpe reappeared, and that perhaps was a good thing, for Sharpe was in a cold fury. And Malachi Braithwaite had made himself an enemy. End of Side 5. Side 6. Chapter 7. The wind was still low the next morning, and the Pucelle seemed hardly to be moving in a greasy sea that slid in long, low swells from the west. It was hot again, so that the seamen went bare-chested, some showing the livid cross-hatching of scars where their backs had been subjected to the lash. "Some wear it as a badge of pride," Chase told Sharpe, "though I hope not on this ship." "You don't flog?" "I must," Chase said, "but rarely. Maybe twice since I took command. That's twice in 3 years. The first was for theft,
and the other was for striking a petty officer who probably deserved to be struck, but discipline is discipline. Lieutenant Haskell would like me to flog more. He thinks it would make us more efficient, but I don't think it needful." He stared morosely at the sails. "No damn wind. No damn wind. What the hell does God think he's doing?" If God would not send a wind, Chase would practice the guns. Like many naval captains, he carried extra powder and shot, bought at his own expense, so that his crew could practice. All morning he had the guns going, every port open, even the ones in his great cabin, so that the ship was constantly surrounded by a pungent white-grey smoke, through which it moved with a painful slowness. "This could mean bad luck," Peel, the second lieutenant, told Sharpe. He was a friendly man, round-faced, round-waisted, and invariably cheerful. He was also untidy, a fact that irritated the first lieutenant, and the bad blood between Peel and Haskell made the wardroom a tense and unhappy place. Sharpe sensed the unhappiness, knew that it upset Chase, and was aware of the ship's preference for Peel, who was far more easy-going than the tall, unsmiling Haskell. "Why bad luck?" "Guns lull the wind," Peel explained seriously. He was wearing a blue uniform coat, far more threadbare than Sharpe's red jacket, though the second lieutenant was rumoured to be wealthy. "It's an unexplained phenomenon," Peel said, "that gunfire depletes wind." He pointed at the vast red ensign at the gaff as proof, and sure enough it hung limp. The flag was not hoisted every day, but at times like this, when the wind was lazily tired, Chase reckoned that an ensign served to show small variations in the breeze. "Why is it red?" Sharpe asked. "That sloop we saw had a blue one." "It depends which admiral you serve," Peel explained. "We take orders from a rear admiral of the Red, but if he was blue, we'd fly blue, and if he was white, white, and if he was yellow, they wouldn't command any ships anyway. Simple, really." He grinned. The red flag, which had the Union flag in its upper corner, stirred sluggishly as a rare gust of warm air disturbed its folds. Off to the east, where the gust came from, there were heaps of clouds, which Peel said were over Africa. "And you'll note the water's discoloured," he added, pointing over the side to a muddy brown sea, "which means we're off a river mouth." Chase timed the gun crews, promising an extra tot of rum to the fastest men. The sound of the guns was astonishing. It pounded the eardrums and shivered the ship before fading slowly into the immensity of sea and sky. The gunners tied scarves about their ears to diminish the shock of the noise, but many of them were still prematurely deaf. Sharpe, curious, went down to the lower deck, where the big 32-pounders lurked, and he stood in wonder as the guns were fired. He had his fingers in his ears, yet even so the whole dark space, punctuated with bright shafts of smoky sunlight, which pierced through the open gun ports, reverberated with each gun's firing. The sound seemed to punch him in the abdomen. It rang in his head, it filled the world. One after the other, the guns hammered back. Each barrel was close to 10 feet long, and each gun weighed nearly 3 tons, and each shot strained the gun's breeching rope taut as an iron bar. The breeching rope was a great cable fixed with eye bolts to the ship's ribs, that looped through a ring at the gun's breech. Half-naked gunners, sweat glistening on their skins, leapt to sponge out the vast barrels, while the gun's chief stopped the vent hole with a leather-encased thumb. Men put in powder bags and shot, rammed them home, then hauled the weapon's muzzle out through the gun port with the rope and pulley tackles fixed on either side of the carriage. "You're not aiming at anything!" Sharpe had to shout to the 5th lieutenant, who commanded one group of guns. "We ain't marksmen!" the lieutenant, who was called Holderby, shouted back. "If it comes to battle, we'll be so close to the bastards that we can't miss. 20 paces at most, and usually less." Holderby paced down the gun deck, ducking under beams, touching men's shoulders at random. "You're dead!" he shouted. "You're dead!" The chosen men grinned and sat gratefully on the shot gratings. Holderby was thinning the crews, as they would be thinned by battle, and watching how well the survivors manned their big guns. The guns, like those on the Calliope, were all fired by flintlocks. The Army's field artillery, none of it so big as these guns, was fired with a linstock, a slow match that glowed red as it burned. But no naval captain would dare have a glowing red-hot linstock lying loose on a gun deck, where so much powder lay waiting to explode. Instead, the guns had flintlocks, though if the flintlock failed, A linstock was suspended in a nearby tub half filled with water. The flintlock's trigger was a lanyard, which the gunner would twitch. The flint would fall, the spark flash, and then the powder-packed reed in the touch-hole hissed, and a 4 or 5-inch flame leapt upwards before the world was consumed by noise, as another flame, twice as long as the gun's barrel, seared into the instant cloud of smoke as the gun crashed back. Sharpe climbed to the deck, and from the deck to the maintop, for only from there could he see beyond the massive bank of smoke to where the shots fell. They fell ragged, some seemingly going as much as a mile before they splashed into the sullen sea, others ripping the surface into spray only 100 yards from the ship. Chase, as the lieutenant had said, was not training his men to be marksmen, but to be fast. There were gunners aboard who boasted they could lay a ball onto a floating target tub at half a mile. But the secret of battle, Chase insisted, was getting close and releasing a storm of shot. "It doesn't have to be aimed," he told Sharpe. "I use a ship to aim the guns. I lay the guns alongside the enemy and let them massacre the bastard. Speed, 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 Sharpe. Speed wins battles." It was just like musketry, Sharpe realized. On land the armies came together, and, as often as not, it was the side that could fire its muskets fastest that would win. Men didn't aim muskets because they were so inaccurate. They pointed their muskets, then fired so that their bullet was just one amongst a cloud of balls that spat towards the enemy. Send enough balls, and the enemy would weaken. Lay two ships close together, and the one that fired fastest should win in the same way. And so Chase harried his gunners, praising the swift ones and chivvying the laggards, and all morning the sea about the ship quivered to the vibration of the guns. A long track of wavering and thinning powder smoke lay behind the ship, proof that she made some progress, though it was frustratingly slow. Sharpe had brought his telescope up the mast, and now trained it eastwards in hope of seeing land, but all he could see was a dark shadow beneath the cloud. He shortened the barrel and trained the glass downwards, to see Malachi Braithwaite pacing up and down the quarter-deck, flinching every time a gun cracked. What to do about Braithwaite? In truth, Sharpe knew exactly what to do, but how to do it, on a ship crammed with over 700 men, was the problem. He collapsed the telescope and put it into a pocket, then for the first time climbed from the maintop, up above the main topsail, to the crosstrees, a much smaller platform than the maintop, where he perched beneath the main topgallant sail. Yet another sail rose above that, the Royal, up somewhere in the sky, though not so high that men did not climb to it, for there was a lookout poised above the Royal's yard, contentedly chewing tobacco as he stared westwards. The deck looked small from here, small and narrow, but the air was fresh, for the ever-present stink of the ship and the rotten egg stench of the powder smoke did not reach this high. The tall mast trembled as two guns fired together. A freak breath of wind blew the smoke away, and Sharpe saw the sea rippling in a frantic fan pattern away from the gun's blasts. Grass did that in front of a field gun, except that the grass became scorched and sometimes caught fire. The sea settled, and the smoke thickened. "Sail!" The man above Sharpe bellowed to the deck, the hail so loud and sudden that Sharpe jumped in fright. "Sail on the larboard beam!" Sharpe had to think which side of the ship was larboard and which starboard, but managed to remember, and trained his telescope out towards the west, but he could see nothing except a hazy line where the sea met the sky. "What do you see?" Haskell, the first lieutenant, called up through a speaking trumpet. "Royals and tops!" the man shouted. "Same course as us, sir!" The gunfire ceased, for Chase now had something else to worry about. The gun ports were closed, and the big guns lashed tight, as a half-dozen men scurried up the rigging to add their eyes to the lookout's gaze. Sharpe could still see nothing on the western horizon, even with the help of the telescope. He was proud of his eyesight, but being at sea demanded a different kind of vision to looking for enemies on land. He swept the glass left and right, still unable to find the strange ship. Then a sudden, tiny blur of dirty white broke the horizon. He lost it, edged the glass back, and there she was. Just a blur, nothing but a blur. But the man above him, without any glass, had seen it, and could distinguish one sail from another. A man settled beside Sharpe on the crosstrees. "It's a Frenchie," he said.
Sharpe recognized him as John Hopper, the big boatswain of the captain's gig.
"You can't tell at this distance, surely?" Sharpe asked. "Cut of the sail, sir," Hopper said confidently. "Can't mistake it." "What is it, Hopper?" Chase, bareheaded and in shirt-sleeves, hauled himself onto the platform. "It could be her, sir. It really could," Hopper said. "She's a Frenchie right enough." "Damn wind," Chase said. "May I, Sharpe?" He held out his hand for the telescope, then trained it west. "Damn it, Hopper, you're right. Who spotted her?" "Pearson, sir." "Triple his rum ration," Chase said, then closed the glass, returned it to Sharpe, and slithered back to the deck in a manner that scared Sharpe witless. "Boats!" Chase shouted, running towards the quarter-deck. "Boats!" Hopper followed his captain, and Sharpe watched as the ship's boats were lowered over the side and filled with oarsmen. They were going to tow the ship, not west towards the strange sail, but north in an attempt to get ahead of her. The men rowed all through the afternoon. They sweated and tugged until their arms were agony. Very slight ripples at the Pucell's flank showed that they were making some progress, but not enough, it seemed to Sharpe, to gain any headway on the far sail. The small breaths of wind that had relieved the heat earlier in the day seemed to have died away completely, so that the sails hung lifeless, and the ship was enveloped in an odd silence. The loudest noises were the footfalls of the officers on the quarter-deck, the shouts of the men urging on the tired oarsmen, and the creak of the wheel as it spun backwards and forwards in the lulling swell. Lady Grace, attended by her maid, and carrying a parasol against the hot sun, appeared on the quarter-deck and stared westwards. Captain Chase claimed the strange sail was now visible from the deck, but she couldn't see it, even with a telescope. "They probably haven't seen us," Chase suggested. "Why not?" she asked. "Our sails have clouds behind them." He gestured to the great cloud range that piled above Africa. "And with any luck, our canvas just blends into the sky." "You think it's the Rivenal?" "I don't know, my lady. She could be a neutral merchantman." Chase tried to sound neutral himself, but his suppressed excitement made it plain he believed the far ship was indeed the Rivenal. Braithwaite was standing under the break of the poop, watching to see if Sharpe joined her ladyship, but Sharpe didn't move. He looked east and saw cat's paws of ripples on the water, the first signs of a freshening wind. The ripples chased and skittered across the long swells, obstinately refusing to come near the Pucelle, but then they seemed to gather together and slide over the sea, and suddenly the sails filled, the rigging creaked, and the towing lines dipped towards the water. "The land wind!" Chase said, "and about time." He went to the quartermaster at the wheel, who at last had some purchase on the rudder. "Can you feel it?" "Aye, aye, sir." The helmsman paused to spit a stream of tobacco juice into a big brass spittoon. "Ain't much, though," he added. "No more than if a little old lady was breathing on the sail, sir." The wind faltered, shivering the sails, then lazily caught again, and Chase turned to watch the sea. "Get the boats in, Mr. Haskell." "Aye, aye, sir." "Tot of rum for the oarsmen." "Aye, aye, sir." Haskell, who believed Chase spoiled his men, sounded disapproving. "Double tot of rum for the oarsmen," Chase said to annoy Haskell. "And wind for us and death to the French." His spirits had risen in the belief that he had found his quarry. Now he must stalk her. "We'll close the angle on her during the night," he told Haskell. "Every inch of canvas, and no lights on board, and we'll wet the sails." A canvas hose was rigged to a pump and used to douse the sails with seawater. Chase explained to Sharpe that wet sails caught more of a light wind than dry, and it did seem as if the soaked canvas worked better. The ship moved perceptibly, though below decks, where the gun smoke lingered, no wind cleared the air. The wind freshened at dusk, and the Pucelle once again heeled to its pressure. Night fell, and officers went round the ship to make certain that not a single lantern was alight anywhere on board, except for one feeble, red-shielded binnacle lamp that gave the helmsman a glimpse of the compass. The course was changed a few points westwards in hope of closing on the far ship. The wind rose still more, so that the sea could be heard coursing down the ship's black and yellow flanks. Sharpe slept, woke, slept again. No one disturbed his night. He was up before dawn and found that the rest of the ship's officers, even those who should have been sleeping, were on the quarter-deck. "She'll see us before we see her," Chase said, meaning that the rising sun would silhouette the Pucelle's topsails against the horizon.
and for a few minutes he considered rousting the off-duty watch to help the topman bring in everything above the mains, but he reckoned the loss of speed would be a worse result, and so he kept his canvas aloft. The men with the best eyesight were all high in the rigging. "If we're lucky," Chase confided in Sharpe, "we may catch her by nightfall." "That soon? If we're lucky," the captain said again, then reached out and touched the wooden rail. The eastern sky was grey now, streaked with cloud, but soon a leak of pink, like the dye from a redcoat's jacket seeping in the rain onto uniform trousers, suffused the grey. The ship quivered to the seas, left a white wake, raced. The pink turned red, and deeper red, glowing like a furnace over Africa. "They'll have seen us by now," Chase said, and took a speaking trumpet from the rail. "Keep your eyes sharp!" he called to the lookouts, then flinched. "Well, that was unnecessary," he chided himself, then corrected the damage by raising the trumpet again and promising a week's worth of rum ration to the man who first sighted the enemy. "He deserves to be dead drunk," Chase said. The east flared to brilliance and became too bright to look at as the sun at last inched above the horizon. Night had gone. The sea was spread naked under the burning sky, and the Pucelle was alone, for the distant sail had vanished. Captain Llewellyn was angry. Everyone on board was irritated. The loss of the other ship had caused morale to plummet on the Pucelle, so that small mistakes were constantly being made. The boatswain's mates were lashing out with their rope ends. Officers were snarling. The crew was sullen. But Captain Llewellyn was genuinely angry and apprehensive. Before the ship sailed from England, he'd taken aboard a crate of grenades. "They're French ones," he told Sharpe, "so I've no idea what's in them. Powder, of course, and some kind of fulminate. They're made of glass. You light it, you throw it, and you pray that it kills someone. Devilish things they are, quite devilish." But the grenades were lost. They were supposed to be in the forward magazine, deep on the orlop deck, but a search by Llewellyn's lieutenant and 2 sergeants had failed to find the devices. To Sharpe, the loss of the grenades was just another blow of ill fortune, on a day that seemed ill-starred for the Pucelle. But Llewellyn reckoned it was far more serious than that. "Some fool might have put them in the hold," he said. "We bought them from the Viper when she was being refitted. They took them in an action off Antigua, and their captain didn't want them. Reckoned they were too dangerous. If Chase finds them in the hold, he'll crucify me, and I don't blame him. Their proper place is in a magazine." A dozen Marines were organized into a search party, and Sharpe joined them in the deep hold where the rats ruled and the ship's stink was foully concentrated. Sharpe had no need to be there. Llewellyn hadn't even asked him to help, but he preferred to be doing something useful rather than endure the bad-tempered disappointment that had soured the deck ever since daybreak. It took 3 hours, but eventually a sergeant found the grenades in a box that had the word biscuit stenciled on its lid. "God knows what's in the magazines, then," Llewellyn said sarcastically. "They're probably full of salt beef. That bloody man Cowper." Cowper was the ship's purser, in charge of the Pucelle supplies. The purser was not quite an officer, but was generally treated as one, and he was thoroughly disliked. "It's the fate of pursers," Llewellyn had told Sharpe, "to be hated. It's why God put them on earth. They're supposed to supply things, but rarely can, and if they do, then the things are usually the wrong size, or the wrong colour, or the wrong shape." Pursers, like the army's sutlers, could trade on their own account, and their venality was famous. "Cowper probably hid them," Llewellyn said, "thinking he could sell them to some benighted savage, bloody man." Now, having cursed the purser, the Welshman took one of the grenades from the box and handed it to Sharpe. "Packed with scrap metal, see? That thing could go off like case shot." Sharpe had never handled a grenade before. The old British ones, long discarded for being ineffective, had resembled a miniature shell that had been launched from a bowl-like attachment at the front of a musket, but this French weapon was made of a dark green glass. The light was poor in the hold, but he held the grenade close to one of the Marines' lanterns and saw that the interior of the glass globe, which was about the size of a decent suet pudding, was packed with scraps of metal. A fuse protruded from one side, sealed with a ring of melted wax. "You light the fuse," Llewellyn said. "Throw the damned thing, and I suppose the glass container shatters when it falls.
The lit fuse communicates to the powder, and that's the end of a Frenchman." He paused, frowning at the glass ball. "I hope." He took the grenade back and fondled it like a baby. "I wonder if Captain Chase would let us try one, if we had men standing by with buckets of water." "Make a dirty mark on his nice clean deck?" Sharpe asked. "I suppose he won't," Llewellyn said sadly. "Still, if it comes to a battle, I'll give some to the boys up the masts, and they can hurl them onto the enemy decks. They have to be good for something." "Chuck 'em overboard," Sharpe advised. "Dear me, no. I don't want to hurt the fish, Sharpe." Llewellyn, hugely relieved by the discovery, had the precious grenades taken to the forward magazine, and Sharpe followed the Marines up the ladder to the orlop deck, which, being beneath the waterline, was almost as dark as the hold. The Marines went forward, while Sharpe went towards the stern, intending to climb to Chase's dining room for midday dinner. But he couldn't use the companionway up to the lower deck, for a man in a faded black coat was clambering unsteadily down the ladder. Sharpe instinctively waited, then saw that it was Malachi Braithwaite who so cautiously descended the rungs. Sharpe stepped swiftly back into the surgeon's cabin, where the red-painted walls and table waited for battle's casualties, and from there he watched Braithwaite take a lantern from a hook beside the companionway. The secretary fumbled with a tinderbox, blew on the charred linen to make a flame, and lit the oil lamp. He put the lamp on the deck, then grunted as he heaved up the aft hatch of the hold to release a stench of bilgewater and rot. Braithwaite shuddered, nerved himself, then took the lantern and clambered down into the ship's depths. Sharpe followed. There were moments in life, he thought, when fate played into his hands. There had been such a moment when he met Sergeant Hakeswill and joined the army, and another on the battlefield at Assaye, when a general had been unhorsed, and now Braithwaite was alone in the hold. Sharpe stood by the hatch and watched Braithwaite's lantern bob as the secretary went slowly down the ladder, and then went aft towards the place where the officer's dunnage was stored. Sharpe dropped down the ladder and carefully pulled the hatch shut behind him. He went stealthily, though any noise his shoes made on the rungs was masked by the creak of the great pine masts, which protruded down through all the decks to be rooted in the elmwood keel. The sound of the flexing masts was magnified in the hold, which also reverberated to the squelching clatter of the ship's 6 pumps, the sound of the sea, and the grating screech of the rudder turning on its pintles. This after part of the hold was isolated from the forward part of the ship by a great heap of water butts and vinegar barrels that stretched from the planking above the bilge to the beams of the orlop deck 12 feet above. Those beams were supported by great shafts of oak that in the dim lantern light looked like the pillars of an old, smoke-darkened church. Braithwaite threaded his way between the oak pillars, climbing the gentle rise of the ship's hull towards a stack of shelves at the very back of the hold that shielded a small space in the stern that was known as the lady hole, because it provided the safest place on board during a battle. There was nothing valuable kept on the shelves, merely the officers' unwanted dunnage, but Lord William had brought so much luggage to the Pucelle that some of it had to be stored here, and Sharpe, crouching in the shadow of some casks of pungent salt beef, watched the secretary climb a short ladder to find a leather case, which he hauled from the top shelf and carried awkwardly back to the deck. He took a key from his pocket and unlocked the case, which proved to be crammed with papers. Nothing there, Sharpe thought, for any light-fingered seaman to filch, though he didn't doubt that some of them would already have picked the case's lock in hope of better spoils. Braithwaite leafed through the papers, found what he wanted, relocked the case, and carried it back up the ladder, where he clumsily pushed it past the wooden bar that kept the shelf's contents from spilling in a high sea. The secretary was muttering to himself, and snatches of his words carried to Sharpe. "I'm an Oxford man, not a slave. Could have waited till we reached England. Get in there, damn you." The case was finally stowed away. Braithwaite came down the ladder, pocketed the sheet of paper, collected his lantern, and started back towards the larger ladder that lay alongside the mizzenmast and led to the closed hatch. He didn't see Sharpe. He thought he was alone in the hold, until a hand suddenly grasped his collar. "Hello, Oxford man," Sharpe said. "Jesus!" Braithwaite swore and shuddered. Sharpe took the lantern from the secretary's nerveless hand
and placed it on top of a cask, then spun Braithwaite round and pushed him hard so that he fell onto the deck.
"I had an interesting conversation with her ladyship the other day," Sharpe said. "It seems you're blackmailing her."
"You're being ridiculous, Sharpe. Ridiculous." Braithwaite thrust himself backwards until he could go no further, then sat with his back against the water casks, where he brushed at the dirt on his trousers and coat.
"Do they teach blackmail at Oxford?" Sharpe asked. "I thought they only taught you useless things, like Latin and Greek. But I'm wrong, am I? They give lectures in blackmail and housebreaking, maybe. Pocket-slitting on the side, perhaps."
"I don't know what you're talking about."
"You know what I'm talking about, Braithwaite," Sharpe said. He picked up the lantern and walked slowly towards the terrified secretary. "You're blackmailing Lady Grace. You want her jewels, don't you, and maybe more? You'd like her in your bed, wouldn't you? You'd like to go where I've been, Braithwaite."
Braithwaite's eyes widened. He was scared, but he was not so witless as to miss the significance of Sharpe's words. Sharpe had admitted the adultery, and that meant Braithwaite was about to die. For Sharpe couldn't afford to let him live and tell the tale.
"I just came to fetch a memorandum, Sharpe,"
the secretary babbled in apparent panic.
"That's all. I came to fetch this paper, just a memorandum, Sharpe, for Lord William's report. Let me show you."
And he put a hand in his pocket to fetch the paper, and brought out not a memorandum, but a small pistol. It was the kind of gun designed to be carried in a purse or pocket, for use against cutthroats or highwaymen. And Braithwaite, his hand shaking, dragged back the flint.
"I've carried this ever since you threatened me, Sharpe."
His voice was suddenly more confident as he levelled the pistol. Sharpe dropped the lantern. It hit the deck. There was a shudder of light, then the smash of glass and utter darkness. Sharpe twisted aside, half expecting to hear the pistol crack. But Braithwaite had retained enough nerve to hold his fire.
"You've got one shot, Oxford man," Sharpe said. "One shot, then it's my turn."
Silence, except for the clatter of the pumps and the noise of the masts and the scratching of rats' feet in the bilge.
"I'm used to this," Sharpe said. "I've crawled in the darkness before, Braithwaite, and killed men, cut their gizzards. I did it outside Gavelgore on a dark night. Cut 2 men's throats, Braithwaite, slit them back to the spine."
He was crouching behind a cask, so that if Braithwaite did fire, then the secretary would merely inflict a wound on a barrel of salt beef. Sharpe kept his body behind the cask and reached out with his left hand, scraping his nails on the plank deck. "I slit their gizzards, Oxford man."
"We can come to an agreement, Sharpe,"
Braithwaite said nervously. He hadn't moved since the hole went dark. Sharpe knew that, for he would have heard. He reckoned Braithwaite was waiting until he went close, and then he'd fire. Just like ship-to-ship fighting. Let the bugger get close, then fire.
"What kind of agreement, Oxford man?"
Sharpe asked, then scratched the deck again, making little noises that would be magnified by the secretary's fear. He found a shard of broken lantern glass and scraped it on the wood.
"You and I should be friends, Sharpe," Braithwaite said. "You and I, we ain't like them. My father's a parson. He doesn't make much, 300 a year. That may sound like a competence to you, but it's nothing, Sharpe, nothing. Yet people like William Hale are born to fortunes. They abuse us, Sharpe. They grind us down. They think we're dirt."
Sharpe tapped the glass scrap against the lantern's metal, then scratched it on wood to make a noise like rats' claws. He reached as far as he could, tapping the glass closer to Braithwaite. Braithwaite would be listening, trying to make sense of the small noises, trying to contain a rising terror.
"By what justification," Braithwaite asked, his voice a tone higher, "can mere birth bestow such good fortune on one man and deny it to another? Are we lesser men because our parents were poor? Must we forever tug the forelock because their ancestors were brutes in plate armour who stole a fortune? You and I should combine, Sharpe. I beg you, think on it."
Sharpe was lying flat on the deck now, reaching towards Braithwaite, grinding the glass on the rough planking, taking the sound ever nearer to the secretary who tried to see something, anything, in the Stygian darkness.
"I never wrote to Colonel Wallace, as I was ordered to," Braithwaite said in desperation. "That was a favour to you, Sharpe.
Can you not apprehend that we're on the same side?" He paused, waiting for an answer to come from the pitch darkness. But there was only the small, scraping sound on the deck in front of him. "Speak, Sharpe!" Braithwaite pleaded. "Or kill Lord William!" Braithwaite's voice was almost sobbing with fear now. "Her ladyship will thank you, Sharpe. Would you like that, wouldn't you, Sharpe? Answer me, Sharpe, for God's sake, answer me!" Sharpe tapped the glass fragment on the deck. He could hear Braithwaite's hoarse breathing. The secretary lunged out a foot, hoping to find Sharpe, but the shoe struck nothing. "I beg you, Sharpe, think of me as a friend. I mean you no harm. How could I, when I so admire your achievements? Her ladyship misconstrued my words, nothing else. She's finely strung, Sharpe, and I'm your friend, Sharpe, your friend." Sharpe tossed the glass scrap so that it rattled among the casks somewhere in the hole's starboard side. Braithwaite gave a yelp of terror, but held his fire, then sobbed as he heard more small noises. "Talk to me, Sharpe! We're not brutes, you and I. We have things in common. We should talk. Talk to me." Sharpe gathered a handful of the broken glass, paused, then threw them towards the secretary, who, as the small scrap struck him, screamed and thrust the pistol blindly forward and pulled the trigger. The small gun flashed blindingly in the hold, and the bullet smacked harmlessly into a timber. Sharpe stood and walked forward, waited for the echo of the shot to die away. "One bullet, Oxford man," he said. "Then it was my turn." "No!" Braithwaite flailed wildly in the dark, but Sharpe kicked him hard, then dropped on him, pinioned his arms and turned the secretary over so that he lay on his belly. Sharpe sat on the small of Braithwaite's back. "Now tell me, Oxford man," he asked softly, "just what you wanted of Lady Grace." "I've written it all down, Sharpe." "Written what down, Oxford man?" Sharpe had Braithwaite's arms held tight. "Everything. About you and Lady Grace. I've left the letter among Lord William's papers with instructions to open it if anything should happen to me." "I don't believe you, Oxford man." Braithwaite gave a sudden heave, trying to release his arms. "I'm not a fool, Sharpe. You think I wouldn't take precautions? Of course I've left a letter." He paused. "Just let me go," he went on, "and we can discuss this." "So, if I let you go," Sharpe said, still holding tight to Braithwaite's arms, "you'll fetch the letter back from Lord William?" "Of course I will. I promise." "And you'll apologize to Lady Grace? Tell her you were wrong about your suspicions?" "Of course I'll do that. Willingly. Gladly." "But you weren't wrong, Oxford man," Sharpe said, stooping close to Braithwaite's head. "Her and me are lovers. Sweat and nakedness in the dark, Oxford man. I couldn't have you telling lies to her, saying it never happened, could I? And now you know my secret, I'm not sure I can let you go after all." "But there's a letter, Sharpe." "You lie like a bloody rug, Braithwaite. There's no letter." "There is!" Braithwaite cried in despair. Sharpe was holding the secretary's arms above his back, pushing them painfully forward, and now he shoved them hard to dislocate both at the shoulders. Braithwaite gave a whimper of pain, then screamed for help, as Sharpe gripped one of his ears and turned his head sideways. Sharpe was trying to find a purchase with his right hand on Braithwaite's face, and Braithwaite attempted to bite him. But Sharpe smacked his face, then gripped a handful of hair and ear and twisted the head hard. "God knows how they did it," Sharpe said, "those bloody jetties, but I watched them, so it must be possible." He wrenched Braithwaite's head again, and the secretary's frantic protest was stilled as his throat was constricted. His breath became a harsh gasping. But still he fought back, trying to heave Sharpe from his back, and Sharpe, amazed that the jetties had made this look so easy, clamped his hands on Braithwaite's head and wrenched it with all his strength. The secretary's breathing became a scratchy whimper, hardly audible over the cacophony of creaking and clanking in the hold. But he still twitched. And so Sharpe took a deep breath, then twisted a second time, and was rewarded with a small, grating scrunch that he reckoned was the spine twisting out of alignment in Braithwaite's neck. The secretary was still now. Sharpe put a finger on Braithwaite's neck, trying and failing to find a pulse. He waited. Still no pulse. No twitches, no breathing. And so Sharpe felt around the deck until he discovered the pistol, which he put into his pocket. Then he stood and heaved the dead man onto his shoulder and staggered forward, pitched left and right by the motion of the ship, until he blundered into the mizzen ladder. He dropped the body there, climbed the ladder, and heaved open the hatch, to the astonishment of a seaman who was passing. Sharpe nodded a greeting, closed the hatch on the corpse and on the rats that scrabbled in the dark, then climbed on into the daylight. He chucked the pistol out of his cabin scuttle. No one noticed. Dinner was salt pork, peas and biscuits. Sharpe ate well. Captain Chase assumed that the Rivenant, if indeed it was the Rivenant that had been glimpsed on the horizon, had seen the Pucell's topsails the previous day despite the cloud bank, and so had turned westwards in the night. "That'll slow her down," he insisted, recovering some of his usual optimism. The wind was fair, for even though the Pucell had now drawn far enough offshore to lose the advantage of the current, they were in the latitudes where the southeast trades blew. "The wind could only get stronger," Chase said, "and the barometer's rising, which is good." Flying fish skittered away from the Pucell's hull. The ill feeling that had pervaded the ship all morning dissipated beneath the warm sun, and under the captain's renewed optimism. "We know she's no faster than us," Chase said, "and we're on the inside of the bend from now to Cadiz." "How far is that?" Sharpe asked. He was taking the air on the quarterdeck after sharing dinner with Chase. "Another month," Chase said. "But we ain't out of trouble yet. We should do well as far as the equator, but after that we could be becalmed." He drummed his fingers on the rail. "But with God's help we'll catch her first." "You haven't seen my secretary, have you, Chase?" Lord William appeared on deck to interrupt the conversation. "Not a sign of him," Chase said happily. "I need him," Lord William said petulantly. Lord William had persuaded Chase to allow him to use his dining cabin as an office. Chase had been reluctant to yield the room with its lavish table, but had decided it was better to keep Lord William happy rather than have him scowling about the ship in frustration. Chase turned to the 5th Lieutenant Holderby. "Did his lordship's secretary take dinner in the wardroom?" he asked. "No, sir," Holderby said. "Haven't seen the fellow since breakfast." "Have you seen him, Sharpe?" his lordship inquired coldly. He did not like talking to Sharpe, but condescended to ask the question. "No, my lord." "I asked him to fetch a memorandum about our original agreement with Holcar. Damn him! I need it." "Perhaps he's still looking for it," Chase suggested. "Oh, he's seasick, my lord," Sharpe added. "The wind's freshened." "I've looked in his cabin," Lord William complained, "and he's not there." "Mr. Collier!" Chase summoned the midshipman who was pacing up and down the weather deck. "We have a missing secretary, a tall, gloomy fellow who dresses in black. Look below decks for him, will you? Tell him he's wanted in my dining cabin." "Aye, sir," Collier said, and dived below to start his search. Lady Grace, attended by her maid, strolled onto the deck and stood a studious distance from Sharpe. Lord William turned on her. "Have you seen Braithwaite?" "Not since this morning," Lady Grace said. "The wretched man has disappeared." Lady Grace shrugged, suggesting that Braithwaite's fate was none of her concern, then turned to watch the flying fish skim over the waves. "I do hope the bugger hasn't fallen overboard," Chase said. "He's got a long swim if he has." "He had no business being on deck," Lord William said in annoyance. "I doubt he's drowned, my lord," Chase said reassuringly. "If he'd fallen, then someone would have seen him." "What do you do then?" Sharpe asked. "Stop the ship and make a rescue," Chase said, "if we can. Did I ever tell you about Nelson and the Minerva?" "Even if you had," Sharpe said, "you'd tell me again." Chase laughed. "Back in 97, Sharpe, Nelson commands the Minerva, fine frigate. He was being pursued by 2 Spanish ships of the line and a frigate when some half-wit falls overboard. Tom Hardy was aboard, wonderful man. He captains the Victory now, and Hardy took a boat to rescue the fellow. See the picture, Sharpe? Minerva fleeing for her life, close pursued by 3 Spaniards, and Hardy and his boat crew, with the wet fellow aboard, can't row hard enough to catch up. So what does Nelson do? He backs his topsails. Can you credit it? Backs his topsails. By God, he says, I won't lose Hardy. Now the Dons can't make head nor tail of this. Why's the fellow stopping?
They think he must have reinforcements coming, so the silly buggers haul their own wind. Hardy catches up, gets aboard, and the Minerva takes off like a scalded cat. Oh, what a great man Nelson is!" Lord William scowled and stared westwards. Sharpe gazed up at the mainsail, trying to trace a rope from its beginning, through blocks and tackles, down to the belaying pins beside the gunwales. Hammocks were being aired over the netting racks, in which they were stuffed during battle to stop musket bullets. A solitary seabird, white and long-winged, curved close to the ship, then soared away into the blue. Mr. Cowper the purser was counting the boarding pikes racked around the mainmast's trunk. He licked a pencil, made a note in a book, shot a scared look at Chase, and waddled away. Holderby, who had the deck, ordered a boatswain's mate for'ard to ring the ship's bell. Chase, still thinking about Nelson, smiled. "Captain, sir! Captain!" It was Harry Collier, erupting into sight on the weather-deck from beneath the quarter-deck. "Calm down, Mr. Collier," Chase said. "The ship isn't on fire, is it?" "No, sir. It's Mr. Braithwaite, sir. He's dead, sir." Everyone on the quarter-deck stared down at the small boy. "Go on, Mr. Collier," Chase said. "He kind of just died. Men don't just die. Well, the master did, but he was old. Braithwaite was young. Did he fall? Was he strangled? Did he kill himself? Enlighten me." "He fell in the hold, sir. Looks like he broke his neck. Off the ladder, sir." "Careless," Chase said, and turned away. Lord William frowned, didn't know what to say, so turned on his heel and stalked back towards the dining cabin, then thought better of it and hurried back to the railing. "Midshipman?" "Sir?" Collier hauled off his cocked hat. "My lord?" "Was there a piece of paper in his hand?" "I didn't see, sir." "Then pray look, Mr. Collier, pray look," Lord William said, "and bring it to my cabin if you find such a thing." He walked away again. Lady Grace looked at Sharpe, who met her eye, kept his expression neutral, then turned to gaze up the mainmast. The body was brought onto the deck. It was plain that poor Braithwaite had slipped off the ladder and fallen, breaking his neck in the process. But it was strange, the surgeon commented with a frown, that the secretary had dislocated both his arms. "Caught them in the ladder's rungs?" Sharpe suggested. "That could be so," Pickering allowed. He did not seem convinced, but nor was he minded to probe the mystery. "But at least it was a quick end." "One hopes so," Sharpe said piously. "Probably struck his head on a barrel." Pickering twisted the corpse's head, looking for a mark, but finding none. He stood up, dusting his hands. "Happens once every voyage," he said cheerfully. "Sometimes more. We have practical jokers, Mr. Sharpe, who like to grease the rungs with soap. Usually when they believe the purser might be using a ladder. It usually ends with a broken leg and much hilarity, but our Mr. Braithwaite was less fortunate." He wrenched the dislocated arms back into place. "Ugly sort of bugger, wasn't he?" Braithwaite's body was stripped and then placed in his sleeping cot, and the sailmaker sewed a stretch of old frayed sailcloth as a lid for the makeshift coffin. The final stitch, as was customary, was threaded through the corpse's nose to make certain he was truly dead. 3 18-pounder cannonballs had been placed in the coffin that was laid on a plank beside the starboard entry port. Chase read the service for the dead. The Pucell's officers, hats off, stood respectfully about the makeshift coffin, which had been covered with a British flag. Lord William and Lady Grace stood beside the entry port. "We therefore commit his body to the deep," Chase read solemnly, "to be turned into corruption, looking for the resurrection of the body, when the sea shall give up her dead, through our Lord Jesus Christ, who at his coming shall change our vile body, that it might be like his glorious body, according to the mighty working whereby he is able to subdue all things to himself." Chase closed the prayer book and looked at Lord William, who nodded his thanks, then spoke a few well-chosen words that described Braithwaite's excellent moral character, his assiduity as a confidential secretary, and Lord William's fervent hopes that Almighty God would receive the secretary's soul into a life of eternal bliss. "His loss," Lord William finished, "is a sad, sad blow." "So it is," Chase said, then nodded at the two seamen who crouched beside the plank, and they obediently lifted it, so that the coffin slid out from beneath the flag. Sharpe heard the edge of the cot strike against the sill of the entry port,
Then there was a splash. Sharpe looked at Lady Grace, who looked back, expressionless. "Hats on," Chase said. The officers went away to their duties, while the seamen carried away the flag and plank. Lady Grace turned towards the quarter-deck steps, and Sharpe, left alone, went to the rail and stared down into the sea. "The Lord giveth," Lord William Hale was suddenly beside Sharpe, "and the Lord taketh away. Blessed be the name of the Lord." Sharpe, astonished that his lordship should deign to speak to him, was silent for a few seconds. "I'm sorry about your secretary, my lord." Lord William looked at Sharpe, who was again struck by his lordship's resemblance to Sir Arthur Wellesley. The same cold eyes, the same hooked nose that looked like a hawk's beak. But something in Lord William's face now suggested amusement, as though his lordship was privy to information that Sharpe did not possess. "Are you really sorry, Sharpe?" Lord William asked. "That's good of you. I spoke well of him just now, but what else could I say? In truth, he was a narrow man, envious, inefficient, and inadequate to his duties, and I doubt the world will much regret his passing." Lord William pulled his hat on, as if to walk away, then turned back to Sharpe. "It occurs to me, Sharpe, that I never thanked you for the service you did for my wife on the Calliope. That was remiss of me, and I apologize. I also thank you for that service, and will thank you further, if we do not speak of it again." "Of course, my lord." Lord William walked away. Sharpe watched him, wondering if there was some game being played that he was unaware of. He remembered Braithwaite's claim to have left a letter among Lord William's papers, then dismissed that idea as a lie. Sharpe reckoned he was seeing dangers where there were none, and so he shrugged the conversation away and climbed first to the quarter-deck and then to the poop, where he stood at the taffrail and watched the wake dissipate in the sea. He heard the footsteps behind him and knew who they belonged to before she came to the rail, where, like him, she stared at the sea. "I've missed you," she said softly. "And I you," Sharpe said. He gazed at the ship's wake, which rippled the place where a shrouded body sank under a stream of bubbles towards an unending darkness. "He fell?" Lady Grace asked. "So it seems," Sharpe said. "But it must have been a very quick death, which is a blessing." "Indeed it is," she said, then turned to Sharpe. "I find the sun tiresomely hot." "Maybe you should go below. My cabin is cooler, I think." She nodded, looked into his eyes for a few seconds, then abruptly turned and went. Sharpe waited 5 minutes, then followed. The Pucelle, if anyone could have seen her from up where the flying fish splashed down into the waves, looked beautiful that afternoon. Warships were not elegant. Their hulls were massive, making their masts seem disproportionately short. But Captain Chase had hung every sail high in the wind, and those royals, studding-sails, and skyscrapers added enough bulk aloft to balance the big yellow and black hull. The gilding on her stern and the silver paint on her figurehead reflected the sun. The yellow on her flanks was bright. Her deck was scrubbed pale and clean, while the water broke white at her stem and foamed briefly behind. Her 74 massive guns were hidden. The rot and damp and rust and stench could not be detected from the outside, but inside the ship the stink was no longer noticed. In the forecastle, the ship's last 3 goats were milked for the captain's supper. In the bilge the water slopped. Rats were born, fought, and died in the hole's deep darkness. In the magazine a gunner sewed powder bags for the guns, oblivious of a whore who plied her trade between the 2 leather screens that protected the magazine's door from an errant spark. In the galley, the cook, one-eyed and syphilitic, shuddered at the smell of some badly salted beef, but put it in the cauldron anyway, while in his cabin at the stern of the weather-deck, Captain Llewellyn dreamt of leading his marines in a glorious charge that would capture the Revenant. 4 bells of the afternoon watch sounded. On the quarter-deck a seaman cast the log, a lump of wood, and let the line trail fast from its reel. He counted the knots in the line as they vanished over the rail, chanting the numbers aloud, while an officer peered at a pocket watch. Captain Chase went to his day cabin and tapped the barometer. Still rising. The off-duty watch slept in their hammocks, swaying together like so many cocoons. The carpenter scarfed a piece of oak into a gun carriage, while in Chase's sleeping cabin an ensign and a lady lay in each other's arms.
"Did you kill him?"
Lady Grace asked Sharpe in a whisper.
"Would it matter if I did?"
She traced a finger down the scar on his face.
"I hated him,"
she whispered.
"From the day he came into William's employment he just watched me. He would drool."
She shuddered suddenly.
"He told me if I went to his cabin he would keep silent. I wanted to slap him. I almost did, but I thought he'd tell William everything if I struck him, so I just walked away. I hated him."
"And I killed him," Sharpe said softly. She said nothing for a while, then she kissed the tip of his nose.
"I knew you did. The very moment William asked me where he was, I knew you'd killed him." "Was it really quick?"
"Not very," Sharpe admitted. "I wanted him to know why he was dying." She thought about that for a while, then decided she did not mind if Braithwaite's end had been slow and painful.
"No one's killed for me before,"
she said. "I carved my way through a bloody army for you, lady," Sharpe said. Then again remembered Braithwaite's claim that he had left a letter for Lord William, and again dismissed his fears, reckoning that the claim had been nothing more than a desperate effort by a doomed man to cling on to life. He wouldn't mention it to Lady Grace. The sun westered, casting the intricate shadow of shrouds and halyards and sails and masts on the green sea. The ship's bell counted the half-hours. 3 seamen were brought before Captain Chase, accused of various sins, and all 3 had their rum rations suspended for a week. A marine drummer boy cut his hand playing with a cutlass, and the surgeon bandaged it, then clipped him about the ear for being a bloody little fool. The ship's cat slept by the galley stove. The purser smelt a cask of water, recoiled from its stench, but chalked a sign on the barrel decreeing that it was drinkable. And just after the sunset, when the west was a furnace blaze, a last bright ray was reflected off a distant sail. "Sail on the larboard quarter!" the lookout shouted. "Sail on the larboard quarter!" Sharpe didn't hear the cry. At that moment he wouldn't have heard the last trump. But the rest of the ship heard the news, and seemed to quiver with excitement. For the hunt was not lost. It still ran, and the quarry was again in sight. Chapter 8. The happy days followed. The fast ship was indeed the Revenant. Chase had never seen the French warship at close quarters, and try as he might, he couldn't bring the Pucelle near enough to see her name. But some of the seamen pressed from the Calliope recognized the cut of the Frenchman's spanker sail. Sharpe stared through his glass and could see nothing strange about that vast sail which hung at the stern of the enemy ship, but the seamen were certain it had been ill-repaired, and, as a consequence, hung unevenly. Now the Frenchmen raced the Pucelle homewards. The ships were almost twins, and neither could gain an advantage on the other without the help of weather, and the god of winds sent them an equal share. The Revenant was to the west, and the 2 ships sailed northwest to clear the great bulge of Africa, and Chase reckoned that would grant the Pucelle an advantage once they were north of the equator, for then the Frenchman must come eastwards to make his landfall. At night Chase worried he'd lose his prey, but morning after morning she was there, ever on the same bearing, sometimes hull down, sometimes nearer, and none of Chase's seamanship could close the gap any more than Montmorin's skills could open it. If Chase edged westwards to try and narrow the distance between them, then the French ship would inch ahead, and Chase would revert to his previous course and curse the lost ground. He prayed constantly that Montmorin would turn eastwards to offer battle, but Montmorin resisted the temptation. He would take his ship to France, or at least to a harbour belonging to France's ally Spain, and the men he carried would spur the French into another attempt to make India a British graveyard. "He'll still have to get through our blockade," Chase said after supper one evening, then shrugged and tempered his optimism. "Oh, that shouldn't be difficult." "Why not?" Sharpe asked. "It ain't a close blockade off Cadiz," Chase explained. "The big ships stay well out to sea, beyond the horizon. There'll only be a couple of frigates inshore, and Montmorin will brush those aside. No,
We have to catch him." The captain frowned. "You can't move a pawn sideways, Sharpe." "You can't?" They spoke during the first watch, which perversely ran from 8 in the evening until midnight, a time when Chase craved company, and Sharpe had become accustomed to sharing brandy with the captain, who was teaching him to play chess. Lord William and Lady Grace were frequent guests, and Lady Grace enjoyed playing the game, and was evidently good at it, for she always made Chase frown and fidget as he stared at the board. Lord William preferred to read after supper, though he did once deign to play against Chase, and checkmated him inside 15 minutes. Alderby, the 5th lieutenant, was a keen player, and when he was invited for supper, he liked helping Sharpe play against Chase. Sharpe and Lady Grace scrupulously ignored each other during those evenings. The trade winds blew them northwards. The sun shone, and Sharpe would ever remember those weeks as bliss. With Braithwaite dead, and Lord William Hale immersed in the report he was writing for the British government, Sharpe and Lady Grace were free. They used circumspection, for they had no choice, yet Sharpe still suspected the ship's crew knew of their meetings. He dared not use her cabin, for fear that Lord William might demand entrance, but she would go to his, gliding across the darkened quarter-deck in a black cloak, and usually waiting for the brief commotion as the watch changed, until she slipped through Sharpe's unlocked door, which lay close enough to the first lieutenant's quarters, where Lord William slept, for folk to assume it was there she went. But even so it was hard to remain unseen by the helmsman. Johnny Hopper, the boatswain of Chase's crew, grinned at Sharpe knowingly, and Sharpe had to pretend not to notice, though he also reckoned the secret was safe with the crew, for they liked him, and universally disliked the contemptuous Lord William. Sharpe and Grace told each other that they were being discreet, but night after night, and even sometimes by day, they risked discovery. It was reckless, but neither could resist. Sharpe was delirious with love, and he loved her all the more because she made light of the vast gulf that separated them. She lay with him one afternoon, when a scrap of sunlight spearing through a chink in the scuttle's deadlight was scribing an oval shape on the opposite bulkhead, and she mentally added up the number of rooms in her Lincolnshire house. 36, she decided, though that doesn't include the front hall or the servants' quarters. "We never counted them at home either," Sharpe said, and grunted when she dug his ribs with an elbow. They lay on blankets spread on the floor, for the hanging cot was too narrow. "So how many servants have you got?" he asked. "In the country, 23, I think, but that's just in the house. And in London, 14. And then there are the coachmen and stable boys. I've no idea how many of those there are. 6 or 7, perhaps?" "I lose count of mine, too," Sharpe said, then flinched. "That hurt!" "Shh!" she whispered. "Chase will hear." "Did you ever have a servant?" "A little Arab boy," Sharpe said, "who wanted to come to England with me. But he died." He lay silent, marvelling at the touch of her skin on his. "What does your maid think you're doing?" "Lying down in the dark, with orders not to be disturbed. I say the sun gives me a headache." He smiled. "So what will you do when it rains?" "I'll say the rain gives me a headache, of course. Not that Mary cares. She's in love with Chase's steward, so she's glad I don't need her. She haunts his pantry." Grace ran her finger down Sharpe's belly. "Maybe they'll run away to sea together." Sometimes it seemed to Sharpe that he and Grace had run away to sea, and they played a game where they pretended the Pucelle was their private ship, and its crew their servants, and that they'd forever be sailing forgiving seas under sunny skies. They never spoke of what waited at journey's end, but then Grace must go back to her lavish world, and Sharpe to his place, and he didn't know whether he'd ever see her again. "We're like children, you and I," Grace said more than once, a note of wonder in her voice. "Irresponsible, careless children." In the morning Sharpe exercised with the Marines. In the afternoons he slept, and in the evening he ate his supper with Chase, then waited impatiently until Lord William was in his laudanum-induced sleep, and Grace could come to his door. They would talk, sleep, make love, talk again. "I haven't had a bath since Bombay," she said one night with a shudder. "Nor have I." "But I'm used to having baths," she said. "Well, you smell good to me." "I stink," she said. "I stink, and the whole ship stinks, and I miss walking. I love to walk in the country. If I had my way, I'd never see London again."
"You'd like the army," Sharpe said. "We're always going for long walks." She lay silent for a while, then stroked his hair.
"I dream sometimes of William's death," she said softly. "Not when I'm asleep, but when I'm awake. That's dreadful."
"It's human," Sharpe said. "I think of it too."
I wish he'd fall overboard," she said, "or slip down a ladder."
"He won't, though." Not without help, Sharpe thought, and he pushed that idea away. Killing Braithwaite was one thing. The private secretary had been a blackmailer. But Lord William had done nothing except be haughty, and married to a woman Sharpe loved. Yet Sharpe did think of killing him, though how it could be done he didn't know. Lord William was hardly likely to descend into the hold, and he was never on deck in the dark of the night when a man might be pushed over the side.
"If he died," Grace said quietly, "I'd be wealthy. I'd sell the London house and live in the country. I'd make a great library with a fireplace, walk the dogs, and you could live with me. I'd be Mrs. Richard Sharpe."
For a moment Sharpe thought he'd misheard her. Then he smiled. "You've missed society," he said.
"I hate society,"
she said vehemently.
"Vapid conversation, stupid people, endless rivalry. I shall be a recluse, Richard, with books from the floor to the ceiling."
"And what will I do?"
"Make love to me," she said, "and glower at the neighbours."
"I reckon I could manage that," Sharpe said, knowing it was a dream, except that all it would take was one man's death to make the dream come true. "Is there a gun port in your husband's cabin?" he asked, knowing he shouldn't ask the question.
"Yes. Why?"
"Nothing," he said. But he'd been wondering whether he could go into the cabin at night and overpower Lord William, and heave him through the gun port. But then he dismissed the idea. Lord William's cabin, like Sharpe's, was under the poop, and close to the ship's wheel, and Sharpe doubted he could commit murder and dispose of the body without alerting the officer on watch. Even the creak of the opening gun port would be too loud. "He's never ill," Grace said on another afternoon when she'd risked coming to Sharpe's cabin. "He's never ill." Sharpe knew what she was thinking, and he was thinking it himself. But he doubted Lord William would have the decency to die of some convenient disease. "Perhaps he'll be killed in the fight with the Rivernail," Sharpe said. Grace smiled. "He'll be down below, my love, safe beneath the waterline." "He's a man," Sharpe said, surprised. "He'll have to fight." "He's a politician, my dear, and he assassinates. He does not fight. He will tell me his life is too precious to be risked, and he will really believe it. Though when we reach England, he'll modestly claim to have played a part in the Rivernail's defeat, and I, like a loyal wife, will sit there and smile while the company admires him. He's a politician." Footsteps sounded outside the cabin, in the space behind the wheel and under the overhang of the poop. Sharpe listened apprehensively, expecting the steps to go away as they usually did. But this time they came right to his door. Grace clutched his hand, then shuddered as a knock sounded. Sharpe did not respond. Then the bolted door shook as someone tried to force it open. "Who is it?" Sharpe called, pretending to have been asleep. "Midshipman Collier, sir." "What do you want?" "You're wanted in the captain's quarters, sir." "Tell him I'll be there in a minute, Harry," Sharpe said. His heart was racing.
"You should go,"
Grace whispered. Sharpe dressed, buckled his sword belt, leant over to kiss her, then slipped out of the door. Chase was standing by the larboard shrouds, gazing at the dot on the horizon that was the Rivernail. "You want to be, sir?" Sharpe asked. "Not me, Sharpe, not me," Chase said. "It's Lord William who wants you." "Lord William?" Sharpe couldn't keep the surprise from his voice. Chase raised an eyebrow as if to suggest that Sharpe had brought this trouble on himself, then jerked his head towards his dining cabin. Sharpe felt a rising panic, subdued it by telling himself Braithwaite had not left a damning letter, straightened his red coat, then went to the dining cabin's door beneath the poop. Lord William's voice invited him to come in. Sharpe obeyed and was negligently waved towards a chair. Lord William was alone in the room, sitting at the long table which was covered with books and papers. He was writing, and the scratch of his pen seemed ominous. He wrote for a long time, ignoring Sharpe. The skylight above the table was open, and the wind rustled the papers on the table. Sharpe stared at his lordship's grey hair, not one out of place. End of Side 6. Side 7.
I'm writing a report.
Lord William broke the silence, making Sharpe jump with guilty surprise.
About the political situation in India.
He dipped the nib in an inkwell, drained it carefully, then wrote another sentence before placing the pen on a small silver stand. His cold eyes were pouchy and glassy, probably from the laudanum that he took each night, but they were still filled with their usual distaste for Sharpe.
I would not normally turn to a junior officer for assistance, but I have small choice under the present circumstances. I'd like your opinion, Sharpe, on the fighting abilities of the Marathas.
Sharpe felt a pang of relief. The Marathas! Ever since entering the cabin he had been thinking of Braithwaite, and his claim to have written a damned letter, but all Lord William wanted was an opinion on the Marathas. "Brave men, my lord," Sharpe said. Lord William shuddered.
I suppose I deserve a vulgar opinion, since I requested it of you,
he said tartly, then steepled his fingers and looked at Sharpe over his well-manicured nails.
It's evident to me, Sharpe, that we must eventually take over the administration of the whole Indian continent. In time that will also become evident to the government. The major obstacles to that ambition are the remaining Maratha states, particularly those governed by Holkar. Let me be specific. Can those states prevent us from annexing their territory?
No, my lord.
Be explicit, please.
Lord William had drawn a clean sheet of paper towards him and had the pen poised. Sharpe took a deep breath.
"They're brave men, my lord,"
he said, risking an irritated glance, "but that ain't enough.
They don't understand how to fight in our way. They think the secret is artillery. So what they do, sir, is line up all their guns in a great row and put the infantry behind them." "We don't do that?"
Lord William asked, sounding surprised.
"We put the guns at the sides of the infantry, sir. That way, if the other infantry attacks, we can rake them with crossfire. Kill more men that way, my lord." "And you," Lord William said acidly as his pen raced over the paper, "are an expert on killing. Go on, Sharpe."
"By putting their guns in front, sir, they give their own infantry the idea that they're protected. And when the guns fall, sir, which they always do, the infantry lose heart. Besides, sir, our lads fire muskets a good deal faster than theirs, so once we're past the guns, it's really just a matter of killing them." Sharpe watched the pen scratch, waited until his lordship dipped it into the inkwell again.
"We like to get close, my lord. They shoot volleys at a distance, but that's no good. You have to march up close, very close, till you can smell them, then start firing." "You're saying their infantry lack the discipline of ours?"
"They lack the training, sir." He thought about it.
"And no, they're not as disciplined." "And doubtless," Lord William said pointedly, "they do not use the lash. But what if their infantry was properly led by Europeans?" "It can be good then, sir. Our sepoys are as good. But the Marathas don't take too well to discipline. They're raiders, pirates. They hire infantry from other states, and a man never fights so well when he's not fighting for his own. And it takes time, my lord. If you gave me a company of Marathas, well, I'd want a whole year to get them ready. I could do it, but they wouldn't like it. They'd rather be horsemen, my lord, irregular cavalry." "So you do not think we need to take Monsieur Vaillard's errand to Paris too seriously?"
"I wouldn't know, my lord."
"No, you wouldn't. Did you recognize Pullman, Sharpe?"
The question took Sharpe utterly by surprise. "No," he blurted with too much indignation.
"Yet you must have seen him—"
Lord William paused to sort through the papers.
"At Assaye."
He found the name which Sharpe suspected he had never forgotten. "Only through a telescope, my lord."
"Only through a telescope."
Lord William repeated the words slowly.
"Yet, Chaser Shoresby, you are very certain in your identification of him. Why else would this man of war be racing through the Atlantic?"
"It just seemed obvious, my lord," Sharpe said lamely.
"Well, the workings of your mind are a constant mystery to me, Sharpe,"
Lord William said, writing as he spoke.
I shall of course moderate your opinions by talking to more senior men when I reach London, but your jejune thoughts will make a first draft possible. Perhaps I shall talk to my wife's distant cousin, Sir Arthur." The pen scratched steadily. "Do you know where my wife is this afternoon, Mr. Sharpe?" "No, my lord," Sharpe said, and was about to ask how he could be expected to know, but bit his tongue in case he heard the wrong answer. "She has a habit of vanishing," Lord William said, his grey eyes now steady on Sharpe. Sharpe said nothing. He felt like a mouse under a cat's gaze. Lord William turned to look at the bulkhead which divided the dining cabin from Sharpe's cabin. He could have been gazing at the picture of Chase's old frigate, the Sprightly, which hung there. "Thank you, Sharpe," he said, looking back at last. "Close the door firmly, will you? The latch is imperfectly aligned with its socket." Sharpe left. He was sweating. Did Lord William know? Had Braithwaite really written a letter? Jesus, he thought, Jesus! Playing with fire. "Well?" Captain Chase had come to stand beside him, an amused expression on his face. "He wanted to know about the Mahratta, sir." "Don't we all?" Chase inquired sweetly. He looked up at the sails, leaned to see the compass, smiled. "The ship's orchestra is giving a concert tonight on the forecastle," he said, "and we're all invited to attend after supper. Do you sing, Sharpe?" "Not really, sir." "Lieutenant Peel sings. It's a pleasure to hear him. Captain Llewellyn should sing, being Welsh, but doesn't, and the lower-deck larboard gun crews make a splendid choir, though I shall have to order them not to sing the ditty about the Admiral's wife, for fear of offending Lady Grace. Yet, even so, it should be a wonderful evening." Grace had left his cabin. Sharpe closed the door, shut his eyes, and felt the sweat trickle beneath his shirt. Playing with fire. 2 mornings later there was an island visible far off to the south and west. The Rivenal must have passed quite close to the island in the night, but at dawn she was well to its north. Cloud hung above the small scrap of grey, which was all Sharpe could see of the island's summit through his telescope. "It's called St. Helena," Chase told him, "and belongs to the East India Company. If we weren't otherwise engaged, Sharpe, we'd make a stop there for water and vegetables." Sharpe gazed at the ragged scrap of land isolated in an immensity of ocean. "Who lives there?" "Some miserable company officials, a handful of morose families, and a few wretched black slaves. Clouter was a slave there. You should ask him about it." "You freed him?" "He freed himself. Swam out to us one night, climbed the anchor cable, and hid away till we were at sea. I've no doubt the East India Company would like him back, but they can whistle in the wind for him. He's far too good a seaman." There were a score of black seamen like Clouter aboard, another score of Lascars, and a scattering of Americans, Dutchmen, Swedes, Danes, and even 2 Frenchmen. "Why would a man be called Clouter?" Sharpe asked. "Because he clouted someone so hard that the man didn't wake up for a week," Chase said, amused, then took the speaking trumpet from the rail and hailed Clouter, who was among the men lounging on the forecastle. "Would you like me to put into St. Helena, Clouter? You can visit your old friends." Clouter mimed cutting his throat, and Chase laughed. It was small gestures like that, Sharpe reckoned, that made the Pucelle a happy ship. Chase was easy in command, and that ease didn't diminish his authority, but simply made the men work harder. They were proud of their ship, proud of their captain, and Sharpe didn't doubt they would fight for him like fiends. But Capitaine Louis Montmorin had the same reputation, and when the 2 ships met, it would doubtless prove a grim and bloody business. Sharpe watched Chase, for he reckoned he had still a lot to learn about the subtle business of leading men. He saw that the captain didn't secure his authority by recourse to punishment, but rather by expecting high standards and rewarding them. He also hid his doubts. Chase couldn't be certain that Pullman's servant really was Michel Vaillard, and he didn't know for sure that he could catch the Rivenal even if the Frenchman was aboard. And if he failed, then the Lords of the Admiralty would take a dim view of his initiative in taking the Pucelle so far from her proper station. Sharpe knew Chase worried about these things, yet the crew never received a hint of their captain's doubts. To them he was certain, decisive, and confident, and so they trusted him. Sharpe noted it, and resolved to imitate it, and then he wondered whether he really would stay in the army. Perhaps Lord William would die.
Perhaps Lord William would have a sleepless night and stroll the poop deck in the dark. And then, Sharpe wondered, what? A library with a fireplace? Grace happy with books, and he with what? But as he asked himself those questions, he would sheer away from their answers, for they involved a murder that Sharpe feared. A man could kill a secretary and pass it off as a fall from a ladder, but a peer of England was not so easily destroyed. Nor had Sharpe any right to kill Lord William. He probably would, he thought, if the chance came, but he knew it would be wrong, and he dimly apprehended that such a wrong would leave a scar on his future. He often surprised himself by realizing he had a conscience. Sharpe knew plenty of men, dozens, who would kill for the price of a pot of ale, yet he was not among them. There had to be a reason, and selfishness was not enough. Even love was not enough. Provoke Lord William to a duel? He thought about that, but he suspected Lord William would never stoop to fight a mere ensign. Lord William's weapons were more subtle. Memoranda to the horse guards, letters to senior officers, quiet words in the right ears, and at their end Sharpe would be nothing. So forget it, Sharpe told himself. Let the dream go. And he tried to lose himself in the work of the ship. He and Llewellyn were holding a competition among the Marines to see who could fire the most musket shots in 3 minutes, and the men were improving, though none could yet match Sharpe. He practised them, encouraged them, swore at them, and morning after morning they filled the ship's forecastle deck with powder smoke, until Sharpe reckoned the Marines were as good as any redcoat company. He practised with the cutlass, fighting Llewellyn up and down the weather deck, slashing and hacking, parrying and slicing, until the sweat ran down his face and chest. Some of the Marines practised with boarding pikes, which were 8-foot ash staffs tipped with slender steel spikes that Llewellyn claimed were marvellously effective for clearing narrow passageways on enemy ships. The Welshman also encouraged the use of boarding axes, which had vicious blades on short handles. "They're clumsy," Llewellyn admitted, "but by God they put the fear of Christ into the froggies. A man don't fight long with one of those buried in his skull, Sharpe, I can tell you. It cools his ardour, it does." They crossed the equator, and because everyone aboard had crossed it before, there was no need to put them through the ordeal of being dressed in women's clothes, shaved with a cutlass, and dipped in sea-water. Nevertheless, one of the seamen dressed himself as Neptune, and went round the ship with a makeshift trident, and demanded tribute from men and officers alike. Chase ordered a double rum ration, hung out a larger studding-sail that the sailmaker had stitched, and watched the River on the northwestern horizon. Then the calms came. For a week the two ships made scarce 40 miles, but just lay on a glassy sea in which their reflections were almost mirror-perfect. The sails hung, and the powder smoke belched by gun practice made a cloud about each ship that didn't shift, so that from a distance the River looked like a patch of fog rigged with masts and sails. Lieutenant Haskell tried to time the Frenchman's volleys by watching the cloud twitch in his telescope. "Only one shot every 3 minutes and 20 seconds, he finally concluded. "They're not trying their hardest," Chase said. "O'Moran's not going to let me know how well his men are trained. You may be assured they're a good deal faster than that." "And how fast are we?" Sharpe asked Llewellyn. The Welshman shrugged. "On a good day, Sharpe, 3 broadsides in 5 minutes. Not that we ever fire a broadside proper. Fire all the guns together, Sharpe, and the bloody ship will fall to bits. But we fire in a ripple, see, one gun after the other. Pretty to watch, it is, and after that the guns fire as they're loaded. The faster crews will easily do 3 shots in 5 minutes, but the bigger guns are slower. But our lads are good. There aren't many Frenchmen who can do 3 shots in 5 minutes. Some days Chase tried to tow the ship closer to the River, but the Frenchman was also using his boats to tow, and so the foes kept their stations. One day a freak breeze carried the River almost beyond the horizon, leaving the Pucelle stranded. But next day it was the British ship's turn to be wafted northwards, while the River lay becalmed. The Pucelle ghosted along, drawing nearer and nearer to the enemy, the ripples of her passage scarcely disturbing the glass-like sea, and foot by foot, yard by yard, cable by cable, she gained on the River, despite the best efforts of the French oarsmen, who were out ahead in their ship's longboats. Still the Pucelle closed the gap, until at last Captain Chase had the tompion pulled from the barrel of his forward larboard 24-pounder. The gun was already loaded, for all the guns were left charged, and the gunner took off the lead touch-hole cover and screwed a flintlock into place. The captain had gone to the forward end of the weather deck, where the Pucell's goats were penned, and crouched beside the open gun port. "We'll load with chain after the first shot," he decided. Chain shot looked at first glance like ordinary round shot, but the ball was split into two halves, and when it left the gun the halves separated. They were joined by a short length of chain, and the two hemispheres whirled through the air, the chain between them, to slice and tear at the enemy's rigging. "Long range for chain shot," the gunner told Chase. "We'll get closer," Chase said. He was hoping to disable the Revenant's sails, then close and finish her with solid shot. "We'll get closer," he said again, stooping to the gun and staring at the enemy that was now almost within range. The gilding on her stern reflected the sunlight. The Tricolour hung limp from the mizzen-gaff, and her rail was crowded with men who must have been wondering why the wind was fickle enough to favour the British. Sharpe was staring through a telescope, hoping for a glimpse of peculiar Cromwell's long hair and blue coat, or of Pullman and his servant, but he couldn't make out the individuals who stood watching the Pucelle glide closer. He could see the ship's name on her stern, see the water being pumped from her bilges, and the copper, now pale green, at her waterline. Then the longboats towing the Revenant were suddenly called back. Chase grunted. "They probably plan to tow her head round," he suggested, "to show us her broadside. Drummer!" A marine boy stepped forward. "Sir?" "Beat to quarters," Chase said, then held up a hand. "No, belay that, belay." The wind was not so fickle after all, and the Revenant's boats had not been recalled to turn the ship, but rather because Montmorin had seen the flickering catspaws of wind ruffling the water at his stern. Now her sails lifted, stretched and tightened, and the Frenchman was suddenly sliding ahead just out of cannon range. "Damn!" Chase said mildly. "Damn and blast his French luck." The flintlock was dismounted, the tompion hammered into the muzzle, the gun-port closed, and the 24-pounder secured. Next day the Revenant pulled ahead again, the beneficiary of an unfair breeze, and by the end of the week of calms, the two ships were again almost an horizon apart, though now the French ship was directly ahead of the Pucelle. "Far enough," Chase said bitterly, "to see her safe into harbour." The next few days saw contrary currents and hard winds from the northeast, so that both ships beat up as close as they could. Chase called it sailing on a bowline, and the Pucelle proved the better sailor, and slowly, so slowly, she began to make up the lost ground. The ship smacked hard into the waves, shattering the seas across the decks and sails. Rain squalls sometimes blotted the Revenant from the Pucelle's view, but she always reappeared, and through his telescope Sharpe could see her pitching like the Pucelle. Once, gazing at the black and yellow warship, he saw strips of canvas flutter at her bow, and she seemed to slew towards him for a few seconds, but in another few heartbeats the Frenchman had hoisted a new sail to replace the one that had blown out. "Worn canvas," the first lieutenant commented. "Reckon that's why we're faster on the wind. Her foresails are threadbare." "Or his stays aren't tight enough," Chase muttered, watching as the Revenant resumed her previous course. "But he made that sail change quickly," he acknowledged ruefully. "He probably had the new sail bent on ready, sir," Haskell suggested. "Like as not," Chase agreed. "He's good our Louis, ain't he?" "Probably got English blood," Haskell said in all seriousness. They passed the Cape Verde Islands, which were more blurs on a rain-smudged horizon, and a week later, in another rainstorm, they glimpsed the Canaries. There was plenty of local shipping about, but the sight of two warships sent them all scurrying for shelter. There was just one more week, maybe a day less, to Cadiz. "You'll make port on my birthday," Chase said, staring through his glass. Then he collapsed the telescope and turned away to hide his bitterness, for unless a miracle intervened, he knew he faced utter failure. He had 1 week to catch the Frenchman, but the wind had backed, and for the next few days the Revenant kept her lead, so that the sun-faded Tricolour at her stern was a constant taunt to her pursuers. "What will Chase do if we don't catch her?" Grace asked Sharpe that night. "Sail on to England," he said. Plymouth, probably, and he imagined landing on a wet autumn afternoon on a stone quay, where he'd be forced to watch Lady Grace going away in a hired four-wheeler. "I shall write to you," she said, reading his thoughts, "if I know where." "Shorncliffe, in Kent, at barracks." He couldn't hide his misery. The stupid dreams of a ridiculous love were fading into a grim reality, just as Chase's hopes of catching the Rivernar were fading. Grace lay beside him, gazing up at the deck, listening to the hiss of rain falling on the deadlight of the cabin's scuttle. She was dressed, for it was almost time for her to slip out of his door and go down to her own cabin, yet she clung to him, and Sharpe saw the old sadness in her eyes. "There's something," she said softly, "that I was not going to tell you." "Not going to tell me?" he asked. "Which means you will tell me." "I was not going to tell you," she said, "because there's nothing to be done about it." He guessed what she was going to say, but let her say it. "I'm pregnant," she said, and sounded forlorn. He squeezed her hand, said nothing. He had known what she was going to say, but was now surprised by it. "Are you angry?" she asked nervously. "I'm happy," he said, and laid a hand on her flat belly. It was true. He was filled with joy, even though he knew that joy had no future. "The child is yours," she said. "You know that?" "I know that. Maybe it's the laudanum, but—" She stopped and shrugged. "It's yours. But William will think it's his." "Not if he can't. He will think what I tell him," she interrupted fiercely, then began to cry and put her head on Sharpe's shoulder. "It is yours, Richard, and I would give the world for the child to know you." But they'd be home soon, and she'd go away, and Sharpe would never see the child, for he and Grace were illicit lovers, and there was no future for them. None. They were doomed. And next morning, everything changed. It was a chill, wet day. The wind was north of northwest, so that the Pucelle sailed hard on her bowline. Rain squalls swept across the sea, seethed on the deck and dripped from the sails. The water was green and grey, streaked by foam and whipped by the wind. The officers on the quarterdeck looked unfamiliar, for they were in thick, oiled coats, and Sharpe, feeling the cold for the first time since he'd gone to India, shivered. The ship bucked and shuddered, fighting sea and wind, and sometimes heeled far over as a gusting squall strained the sails. 7 men manned the double wheel, and it needed all their combined strength to hold the heavy ship up into the wind's teeth. "A touch of autumn in the air," Captain Chase greeted Sharpe. Chase's cocked hat was covered with canvas and tied beneath his chin. "Did you have breakfast?" "I did, sir." It was not much of a breakfast, for supplies were getting low on the Pucelle, and the officers, like the men, subsisted on short rations of beef, ship's biscuit, and Scotch coffee, which was a vile concoction of burnt bread dissolved in hot water and sweetened with sugar. "We're gaining on him," Chase said, nodding towards the distant Rivernar, which was evidently having as hard a time as the Pucelle, for she was shattering the seas with her bluff bow and smothering her hull in spray as she pushed as near northwards as her helmsman could manage. The Pucelle closed the gap relentlessly, as she always did when the ships were hard on the wind. But just after the second bell of the forenoon watch, the breeze went into the south-southwest, and the Rivernar was no longer struggling into the wind, but could sail with her canvas spread to the treacherous wind's kindness, and so keep her lead. Then, just a half-hour later, she unexpectedly turned to the east, which meant she was heading towards the Straits of Gibraltar instead of Cadiz. "Starboard! Starboard!" Chase called to the helmsman. Haskell ran up to the quarterdeck as the 7 men spun the Pucelle's wheel. Sail-handlers ran about the deck loosing sheets. The sails flapped, spattering rainwater across the deck. "Has she blown out her foresails again?" Haskell shouted over the noise of the beating canvas. "No," Chase said. The Frenchman was travelling faster and easier now, sliding across the waves to leave a track of ragged white water at her stern. "He's making for Toulon," Chase decided. But no sooner had he spoken than the Rivernar turned back onto her old course, and the Pucelle's watch, who had just loosened her sheets, had to haul them tight again. "Follow him!"
Chase called to the quartermaster, and pulled out his glass again, unhooded the lens, and stared at the Frenchman. "What the devil is he doing? Is he taunting us? Knows he's safe and wants to mock us? Blast him!" The answer came 10 minutes later, when a lookout called that a sail was in sight. 20 minutes more, and there were 2 sails out on the northern horizon, and the closer of the 2 had been identified as a British frigate. "Can't be the blockading squadron," Chase said, puzzled, "because we're too far south." A moment later the second ship came into clearer view, and she too was a Royal Navy frigate. The Revenant had plainly changed course to avoid the 2 ships, fearing from her first glimpse of their topsails that they might be British ships of the line. But then, realizing that she was faced by 2 mere frigates, she decided to fight her way through to Cadiz. "We shall have no trouble brushing them aside," Chase said gloomily. "Their only hope of stopping her is by laying themselves right across her course." Signals were suddenly flying in the breeze. Sharpe couldn't even see the distant frigates, but Hopper, the boatswain of Chase's crew, could not only see them, but could identify the nearer ship. "She's the Euryalus, sir." "Henry Blackwood, by God!" Chase said. "He's a good man." Tom Connors, the signal lieutenant, was halfway up the mizzen ratlines, where he gazed through a glass at the Euryalus, which was flying a string of bright flags from her mizzen yard. "The fleet's out, sir!" Connors called excitedly, then amended his report. "Euryalus wants us to identify ourselves, sir, but she also says the French and Spanish fleets are out." "My God! Bless me!" Chase, his face suddenly stripped of all its tiredness and disappointment, turned to Sharpe. "Fleets out?" He sounded disbelieving and exultant at the same time. "You're certain, Tom?" he asked Connors, who was now running up to the flag lockers on the poop. "Of course you're sure. They're out." Chase couldn't resist dancing 2 or 3 celebratory steps that were made clumsy by his heavy tarpaulin coat. "The frogs and dons, they're out! By God, they're out!" Haskell, normally so stern, looked delighted. The news was racing round the ship, bringing off-duty men up to the deck. Even Cowper the purser, who normally stayed mole-like in the lower depths of the ship, came to the quarter-deck, hurriedly saluted Chase, then gazed northwards as though expecting to see the enemy fleet on the horizon. Pickering the surgeon, who normally didn't stir from his cot till past midday, lumbered on deck, glanced at the far frigates, then muttered that he was going out of range, and went back below. Sharpe didn't quite understand the excitement and surprise that had quickened the crew. Indeed, it seemed to him that the news was grim. Lieutenant Peel slapped Sharpe's back in his joy, then saw the confusion on the soldier's face. "You don't share our delight, Sharpe?" "Isn't it bad news, sir, if the fleet's out?" "Bad news? Good Lord above, no! They won't be out without our permission, Sharpe. We keep 'em buckled up with a close blockade, so if they're out, it means we let 'em out, and that means our own fleet's somewhere close by. Monsieur Crapo and Senor Don are dancing to our tune now, Sharpe. Our tune. It'll be a hot one." It seemed Peel was right, for when the Pucelle hoisted a string of flags that identified her and described her mission, there was a long wait while that message was passed on by the British frigates to other ships that evidently lay beyond the horizon. And if there were other ships across that grey skyline, then it could only mean that the British fleet was also out. All the fleets were out. The battleships of Europe were out, and Chase's quarter-deck rejoiced. The Revenant sailed on, ignored by the 2 frigates which had bigger fish to fry than one lone French 74. The Pucelle still dutifully pursued her, but then another flurry of colour broke out among the sails of the Euryalus, and everyone on the quarter-deck stared at the signal lieutenant, who in turn gazed through a glass at the frigate. "Hurry!" Chase said under his breath. "Vice Admiral Nelson's compliments, sir," Lieutenant Connors said, scarce able to conceal his excitement. "And we're to bear north-northwest to join his fleet." "Nelson!" Chase said the name with awe. "Nelson! By God, Nelson!" The officers actually cheered. Sharpe stared at them in astonishment. For over 2 months they had pursued the Revenant, using every ounce of seamanship to close on her. Yet now, ordered to abandon the chase, they cheered? The enemy ship was just a sail away? "We're a gift from heaven, Sharpe," Chase explained. "A ship of the line? Of course Nelson wants us. We had guns. We're in for a battle, by God we are too. Nelson against the frogs and the dons. This is heaven. And the Revenant? Sharpe asked. If we don't catch her, Chase asked airily, what does it matter? It might matter in India. Well, that'll be the army's problem, Chase said dismissively. Don't you understand, Sharpe? The enemy fleet's out. We're going to pound them to splinters. No one can blame us for abandoning a chase to join battle. Besides, it's Nelson's decision, not mine. Nelson, by God! Now we're in good company. He danced another brief and clumsy hornpipe before picking up his speaking trumpet to call out the orders that would turn the Pucelle towards the British fleet that lay beyond the horizon. But before he could even draw breath, a shout came from the main cross-trees that another fleet was visible on the northern horizon. "Stand on!" Chase ordered the quartermaster at the wheel, then ran for the main shrouds, followed by a half-dozen officers. Sharpe went more slowly. He climbed the rain-soaked ratlines, negotiated the lubber's hole, and trained his telescope north, but he could see nothing except a wind-broken sea and a mass of clouds on the horizon. "The enemy!" Captain Llewellyn of the Marines had arrived beside Sharpe on the maintop's grating. He breathed the words. "My God, it's the enemy." "And the Revenant will join them," Chase said. "That's my guess. They'll be as glad of Montmoren's company as Nelson is of ours." He turned and grinned at Sharpe. "You see, we may not have lost her after all." The enemy? Sharpe could still see nothing but clouds and sea. But then he realized that what he'd mistaken for a streak of dirty white cloud on the horizon was in fact a mass of topsails. A fleet of ships was on that horizon, and sailing straight towards his glass, so that their sails coalesced into a blur. God alone knew how many ships were there, but Chase had said that the combined navies of France and Spain had put out to sea. "I see 30, Lieutenant Haskell said uncertainly. "Maybe more." "And they're coming south," Chase said, puzzled. "I thought the rascals were supposed to be going north to cover the invasion." "It's French navigators," Lieutenant Peel, the rotund man who'd sung so beautifully at the concert, said. "I think Britain's off Africa." "They can sail to China so long as we catch them," Chase said, then collapsed his telescope and disappeared down the Flutter Shrouds. Sharpe stayed in the maintop until a squall of rain blotted the far fleet from view. The Pucelle turned westwards, but the fickle wind turned with her, so that she had to beat her way out into the Atlantic, thumping the cold waves to spatter spray down the holystone decks. The enemy fleet was soon lost to sight, but Chase's course took the Pucelle past two more frigates, which formed the fragile chain connecting Nelson's fleet with the enemy. The frigates were the scouts, the cavalry, and, having found the enemy, they stayed with her, and sent messages back down the long windy links of their chain. Connors watched the bright-coloured flags and passed on their news. The enemy, he reported, was still sailing south, and the Euryalus had counted 33 ships of the line and 5 frigates. But 2 hours later the total was increased by 1 ship of the line, because the Revenant, as Chase had foreseen, had been ordered to join the enemy's fleet. 34 prizes, Chase said exultantly. "My God, we'll hammer them!" The last link in the chain was not a single-decked frigate, but a ship of the line, which, to Sharpe's amazement, was identified even before her hull showed above the horizon. "It's the Mars," Lieutenant Haskell said, peering through his glass. "I'd know that mizzen topsail anywhere." "The Mars!" Chase's spirits were flying high to the heavens now. "Georgie Duff, eh? He and I were midshipmen together, Sharpe. He's a Scotsman," he added as though that were relevant. "Big fellow he is, big enough to be a prize-fighter. I remember his appetite. Never had enough to eat, poor fellow." A string of flags appeared at the Mars's mizzen. "All number, sir," Connors reported, then waited a few seconds. "What brings you home in such a hurry?" "Give Captain Duff my compliments," Chase said happily, "and tell him I knew he'd need some help." The signal lieutenant dragged flags from their lockers. A midshipman bent them onto the halyard, and a seaman hauled them up. "Captain Duff assures you, sir, that he will not permit us to come to any harm," Connors reported after a moment. "Ho! He's a good fellow," Chase said, delighted with the insult. "A good fellow." An hour later, another cloud of sail appeared. Only this one was on the western horizon,
and it grew from a blurred smear into the massed sails of a fleet. 26 ships of the line, not counting the Mars or the Pucelle, were sailing northwards, and Chase took his ship towards the head of the line, while his officers crowded at the quarterdeck's lee rail and gazed at the far ships. Lord William and Lady Grace, both bundled in heavy cloaks, had come on deck to see the British fleet. "There's the Tonnant!" Chase exulted. "See her? A lovely ship, just lovely. An 84. She was captured at the Nile. God, I remember seeing her coming to Gibraltar afterwards, all her topmasts gone and blood-crusted at her scuppers. But don't she look wonderful now? Who has her?" "Charles Tyler," Haskell said. "What a good fellow he is, to be sure. And is that the Swiftsure?" "It is, sir." "My God, she was at the Nile too. Ben Hallowell had her then. Dear Ben. She's under Willie Rutherford now," he said to Sharpe, as though Sharpe would know the name. "And he's a good fellow, a capital fellow. Look at that copper on the Royal Sovereign. New, eh? She'll be sailing quick as you like." He was pointing to one of the bigger warships, a great brute with 3 gun decks, and Sharpe, peering through his glass, could see the bright gleam of her newly coppered hull whenever she leant to the wind. The other ships, when they tilted to the breeze, showed a band of copper turned green by the sea, but the Royal Sovereign's lower hull shone like gold. "She's Admiral Collingwood's flagship," Chase told Sharpe, "and he's a good fellow. Not as nice as his dog, but a good fellow." To Chase, they were all good fellows. There was Billy Hargood, who was sailing the Belle-Isle, a 74 that had been captured from the French, and Jimmy Morris of the Colossus, and Bob Morsum of the Revenge. "Now, there's a fellow who knows how to train a ship," Chase said warmly. "Wait till you see her in battle, Sharpe. She can fire broadsides faster than anyone." "The Dreadnought's faster," Peel suggested. "The Revenge is much quicker," Haskell said, irritated by the second lieutenant's comment. "The Dreadnought's quick, no doubt of it, she's quick." Chase tried to mediate between his senior lieutenants. He pointed out the Dreadnought to Sharpe, who saw another 3-decker. "Her guns are quick," Chase said, "but she's painful slow on the wind. John Conn has her, doesn't he?" "He does, sir," Peel said. "What a good fellow he is. I wouldn't like to bet a farthing on which of them is swifter with their guns, Conn or Morsum. Pity the enemy ships that draw them as dancing partners, eh? Look, the Orion! She was at the Nile. Edward Codrington has her now. What a good fellow he is. And his wife Jane's a lovely woman. Look, is that the Prince? It is. Sails like a haystack." He was pointing to another 3-decker that thumped her way northwards. "Dick Grindle, what a first-rate fellow he is." Behind the Prince was another 74, that even to Sharpe's untutored eye looked just like the Rivenor or the Pucelle. "Is she French?" he asked, pointing. She is, Chase said. "The Spartiate, and she's bewitched, Sharpe." "Bewitched? Sails faster at night than she does by day." "That's because she's built of stolen timbers," Lieutenant Holderby opined. "Sir Francis Laforey has her," Chase said, "and he's a capital fellow." "Look, there's a minnow. Which is she?" "The Africa," Peel answered. "Only 64 guns," Chase said. "But she's under the command of Harry Digby, and there isn't a finer fellow in the fleet." "Or richer," Haskell put in dryly, then explained to Sharpe that Captain Henry Digby had been monstrous fortunate in the matter of prize money. "An example to us all," Chase said piously. "Is that the Defiance?" "By God, it is! She was badly cut about at Copenhagen, wasn't she? Who's her captain now?" "Philip Durham," Peel said, then silently mouthed Chase's next 4 words. "What a fine fellow," Chase explained. "And look, the Saucy!" "The Saucy?" Sharpe asked. "The Temeraire." Chase dignified the vast 3-decker with her proper name. 98 guns. Who has her now?" "Eliab Harvey," Haskell answered. So he does. Odd sort of name, eh, Eliab? I've never met him, but I'm sure he's a prime fellow, prime. And look, the Achille. Dick King has her, and what a splendid fellow he is. And look, Sharpe, the Billy Ruffian. All's well if the Billy Ruffian's here." "The Billy Ruffian?" Sharpe asked, puzzled by the name that was evidently attached to a 2-decker 74 that otherwise looked quite unremarkable. "The Bellerophon, Sharpe. She was Howe's flagship at the glorious 1st of June, and she was at the Nile, by God. Poor Henry Darby was killed there, God rest his soul.
He was an Irishman, and a capital soul, just capital. John Cook has her now, and he's as stout a fellow as ever came from Essex." "He came into money," Haskell said, "and moved to Wiltshire." "Did he now? Good for him," Chase said, then trained his glass on the Bellerophon again. "She's a quick ship," he said enviously, though his Pucelle was just as fast. "A lovely ship, Medway built. Where was she launched?" "86, Haskell answered. "And she cost £30,232, 14 shillings and threepence," Midshipman Collier interjected, then looked ashamed for his interruption. "Sorry, sir," he said to Chase. "Don't be sorry, lad. You sure?" "Of course you're sure. Your father's a surveyor in the Shearers' Dockyard, ain't he? So what was the threepence spent on?" "Don't know, sir." "Halfpenny nail, probably," Lord William said acidly. "The peculation in His Majesty's dockyards is nothing short of scandalous." "What is scandalous," Chase retorted, stung to the protest, "is that the government permits ill-founded ships to be given to good men." He swung away from Lord William, frowning, but his good spirits were restored by the sight of the British fleet's black and yellow hulls. Sharpe just gazed at the fleet in awe, doubting he would ever see a sight like this again. This was the majesty of Britain, a deep-sea fleet, a procession of majestic gun batteries, vast, ponderous, and terrible. They moved as slowly as fully laden harvest wagons, their bluff bows subduing the seas, and the beauty of their black and yellow flanks hiding the guns in their dark bellies. Their sterns were gilded, and their figureheads a riot of shields, tridents, naked breasts, and defiance. Their sails, yellow, cream, and white, made a cloud bank, and their names were a roll call of triumphs: Conqueror and Agamemnon, Dreadnought and Revenge, Leviathan and Thunderer, Mars, Ajax, and Colossus. These were the ships that had cowed the Danes, broken the Dutch, decimated the French, and chased the Spanish from the seas. These ships ruled the waves. But now one last enemy fleet challenged them, and they sailed to give it battle. Sharpe watched Lady Grace standing tall beside the mizzen shrouds. Her eyes were bright. There was colour in her cheeks, and awe on her face as she stared at the stately line of ships. She looked happy, he thought, happy and beautiful. Then Sharpe saw that Lord William also watched her, a sardonic expression on his face. Then he turned to gaze at Sharpe, who hastily looked back to the British fleet. Most of the ships were two-deckers. 16 of those, like the Pucelle, carried 74 guns, while 3, like the Africa, only had 64 guns apiece. One two-decker, the captured French Tonnant, carried 84 guns, while the other 7 ships of the fleet were the towering triple-deckers, with 98 or 100 guns. Those ships were the brute killers of the deep, the slab-sided gun batteries that could hurl a slaughterous weight of metal. But Chase, without showing any alarm at the prospect, told Sharpe there was a famous Spanish four-decker, the largest ship in the world that carried over 130 guns. "Let's hope she's with their fleet," he said, "and that we can lay alongside her. Think of the prize money." "Think of the slaughter," Lady Grace said quietly. "It hardly bears contemplation, my lady," Chase said dutifully. "Hardly bears it at all, but I warrant we shall do our duty." He put his telescope to his eye. "Ah!" he exclaimed, staring at the leading British ship, a three-decker with ornate gilt-work climbing and wreathing her massive stern. "And there's the best fellow of them all. Mr. Haskell, a 17-gun salute, if you please." The leading ship was the Victory, one of the 300-gun ships in the British fleet, and also Nelson's flagship, and Chase, gazing at the Victory, had tears in his eyes. "What I wouldn't do for that man!" he exclaimed. "I never fought for him myself, and thought I'd never have the chance." Chase cafted his eyes as the first of the Pucelle's guns banged from the weather-deck in salute of Lord Horatio Nelson, Viscount and Baron Nelson of the Nile and of Burnham Thorpe, Baron Nelson of the Nile and of Hilborough, Knight of the Most Honourable Order of the Bath and Vice-Admiral of the White. "I tell you, Sharpe," Chase said, still with tears on his cheeks, "I would sail down the throat of hell for that man." The Victory had been signalling to the Mars, which in turn was passing the messages on down the chain of frigates to the Euryalus, which lay closest to the enemy.
But now the flagship's signal came down, and a new ripple of bright flags ran up her mizzen. The Pucell's guns still fired the salute, the shots screaming out to fall in the empty ocean to starboard. "Our numeral, sir!" Lieutenant Connors called to Captain Chase. "He makes us welcome, sir, and says we're to paint our mast hoops yellow." "Yellow?" He sounded puzzled. "Yellow, sir. It does say yellow, and we're to take station astern of the Conqueror." "Acknowledge," Chase said, and turned to stare at the Conqueror, a 74 which was sailing some distance ahead of a three-decker, the Britannia. "She's a slow ship," Chase muttered of the Britannia. Then he waited for the last of the 17 guns to sound before seizing the speaking trumpet. "Ready to tack!" He had some tricky seamanship ahead, and it would have to be done under the eyes of a fleet that prized seamanship almost as much as it valued victory. The Pucelle was on the starboard tack, and needed to go about so that she could join the column of ships which sailed north on the larboard tack. Yet as she turned into the wind, she would inevitably lose speed, and, if Chase judged it wrong, he would end up becalmed and shamed in the wind-shadow of the Conqueror. He had to turn his ship, let her gather speed, and slide her smoothly into place, and if he did it too fast, he could run aboard the Conqueror, and too slow, and he would be left wallowing motionless under the Britannia's scornful gaze. "Now, quartermaster, now!" he said, and the 7 men hauled on the great wheel, while the lieutenants bellowed at the sail-handers to release the sheets. "Israel Pellew has the Conqueror," Chase remarked to Sharpe, "and he's a fine fellow, and a wonderful seaman, wonderful seaman. From Cornwall, you see. They seem to be born with salt in their veins, those Cornish fellows. Come on, my sweet, come on." He was talking to the Pucelle, which had turned her bluff bows into the wind, and for a second it seemed she would hang there helplessly. But then Sharpe saw the bowsprit moving against the cavalcade of British ships, and men were running across the deck, seizing new sheets and hauling them home. The sails flapped like demented things, then tightened in the wind, and the ship leant, gathered speed, and headed docilely into the open space behind the Conqueror. It had been done beautifully. "Well done, quartermaster," Chase said, pretending he'd felt no qualms during the manoeuvre. "Well done, Pucelles. Mr. Holderby, muster a work party and break out some yellow paint." "Why yellow?" Sharpe asked. "Every other ship has yellow hoops," Chase said, gesturing back down the long line, "while ours are like the French hoops, black." Only the upper masts were made from single pine trunks, while the lower were formed from clusters of long timbers that were bound and seized by the iron hoops. "In battle," Chase said, "maybe that's all anyone will note of us, and they'll see black hoops and think we're a frog ship, and pour 2 or 3 decks of good British gunnery into our vitals. Can't have that, Sharpe, not for a few slaps of paint." He turned like a dancer, unable to contain his elation. For his ship was in the line of battle. The enemy was at sea, and Horatio Nelson was his leader. Chapter 9. The British fleet tacked after dark, the signal passed on from ship to ship by lanterns hung in the rigging. Now, instead of sailing northwards, the fleet headed south, staying parallel to the enemy ships, but out of their sight. The wind had dropped, but a long swell ran from the western darkness to lift and drop the ponderous hulls. It was a long night. Sharpe went on deck once and saw the stern lanterns of the Conqueror reflecting from the seas ahead. Then he gazed eastwards as a brilliant flame showed briefly on the horizon. Lieutenant Peel, bundled against the cold, reckoned it was one of the frigates setting off a firework to confuse the enemy. "Keeping them awake, Sharpe, keeping them worried." Peel slapped his gloved hands together and stamped his feet on the deck. "Why are they sailing south?" Sharpe asked. He was shaking. He'd forgotten just how the cold could bite. "The good Lord alone knows," Peel said cheerfully, "and he ain't telling me. They aren't got to cover an invasion force in the Channel, that's for certain. They're probably heading for the Mediterranean, which means they'll keep on south until they're clear of the shallows off Cape Trafalgar. Then they can run east towards the Straits." "Does your chess improve?" "No," Sharpe said. "Too many rules." He wondered whether Lady Grace would risk coming to his cabin, but he doubted it, for the night-shrouded ship was unnaturally busy as men readied themselves for the morning. A seaman brought him a cup of Scotch coffee, and he drank the bitter liquid, then chewed on the sweetened breadcrumbs that gave the coffee its flavour.
"This'll be my first battle," Peel admitted suddenly.
"My first at sea," Sharpe said.
"It makes you think," Peel said wistfully.
"It's better once it starts," Sharpe suggested. "It's the waiting that's hard." Peel laughed softly.
"Some clever bugger once remarked that nothing concentrates the mind so much as the prospect of being hanged in the morning."
"I doubt he knew," Sharpe said. "And besides, we're the hangman tomorrow."
So we are,
Peel said, though he couldn't hide the fears that gnawed at him.
"Of course, nothing might happen," he said. "The buggers might give us a slip."
He went to look at the compass, leaving Sharpe to stare into the darkness. Sharpe stayed on deck until he could abide the cold no longer, then went and shivered in his confining cot that felt so horribly like a coffin. He woke just before dawn. The sails were flapping, and he put his head out of his cabin door and asked Chase's steward what was happening.
"We're wearing ship, sir. Going north again, sir. There's coffee coming, sir. Proper coffee. I saved a handful of beans, because the captain does like his coffee. I'll bring you shaving water, sir."
Once he had shaved, Sharpe pulled on his clothes, draped his borrowed cloak about his shoulders, and went on deck to find that the fleet had indeed turned back to the north. Lieutenant Haskell now had the watch, and he reckoned that Nelson had been running southwards to keep out of the enemy's sight, so that they wouldn't use the excuse of his presence to return to Cadiz. But as the first grey light seeped along the eastern horizon, the Admiral had turned his fleet in an attempt to get between the enemy and the Spanish port. The wind was still light, so that the line of great ships lumbered northwards at less than a man's walking pace. The sky brightened, burnishing the long swells with shifting bands of silver and scarlet. Euryalus, the frigate which had dogged the enemy fleet ever since it had left harbour, was now back with the fleet, while to the east, almost in line with the burning sky where the sun rose, was a streak of dirty cloud showing against the horizon. That streak was the topsails of the enemy, blurred by distance.
"Good God!"
Captain Chase had emerged on deck and spotted the far sails. He looked tired, as though he'd slept badly, but he was dressed for battle, doing honour to the enemy by wearing his finest uniform, which was normally stored deep in his sea-chest. The gold on the twin epaulets gleamed. His tasselled hat had been brushed till it shone. His white stockings were of silk. His coat was neither faded by the sun nor whitened by salt, while his sword scabbard had been polished, as had the silver buckles on his clean shoes.
"Good God!" he said again. "Those poor men!"
The decks of the British ships were thick with men, all staring eastwards. The Pucelle had seen the French and Spanish fleet on the previous day, but this was the first glimpse for the other crews of Nelson's ships. They had crossed the Atlantic in search of this enemy, then sailed back from the West Indies, and in the last few days they had tacked and worn ship, sailed east and west, north and south, and some had wondered if the enemy was at sea at all. Yet now, as if summoned by a demon of the sea, 34 enemy ships of the line showed on the horizon.
"You'll not see its like again,"
Chase told Sharpe, nodding towards the enemy fleet. His steward had brought a tray with mugs of proper coffee onto the quarter-deck, and Chase gestured that his officers should be served first, then took the last cup. He looked up at the sails, which alternately stretched in the wind, then slackened as the fitful gusts passed.
"It'll take hours to come up with them," he said moodily.
"Maybe they'll come to us," Sharpe said, trying to raise Chase's spirits that seemed dampened by the dawn and the pitiful wind.
"Against this sorry excuse for a breeze, I doubt it."
Chase smiled.
"Besides, they won't want battle. They've been stuck in harbour, Sharpe. Their sail-handling will be poor, their gunnery rusty, their morale down in the mud. They'd rather run away."
"Why don't they?"
"Because if they run east from here, they'll end up on the shoals of Cape Trafalgar. If they run north or south, they know we'll intercept them and beat them to smithereens, and that means they have nowhere to go. Nowhere to go, Sharpe. We have the weather gauge, and that's like having the higher ground. I just pray we catch them before dark. Nelson fought the Nile in the dark, and that was a triumph, but I'd rather fight in daylight."
He drained his coffee.
"Is that really the last of the beans?"
he asked the steward.
"It is, sir, except for those that got wetted in Calcutta, sir, and they're growing fur. "It might grind, though," Chase suggested. "I wouldn't feed him to a pig, sir." The Victory had been flying a signal which ordered the British column to form their proper order, which was little more than an encouragement for the slower ships to press on more sail and close the intervals in the line. But now that signal was hauled down and another flew in its place. "Prepare for battle, sir," Lieutenant Connors reported, though it was scarcely necessary, for every man aboard, except the landlubbers like Sharpe, had recognized the signal, and the Pucelle, like the other warships, was already preparing. Indeed, the men had been readying their ship all night. Sand was scattered on the decks to give the barefooted gunners a better grip. The men's hammocks, as they were every morning, were rolled tight, and brought on deck where they were laid in the hammock nettings that surmounted the gunwale. The packed hammocks, secured in the net trough and lashed down under a canvas rain cover, would serve as a bulwark against enemy musket fire. Up aloft a boatswain was leading a dozen men who were securing the ship's great yards, from which the vast sails hung with lengths of chain. Other men were reeving spare halyards and sheets, so that heavy coils of rope were forever tumbling through the rigging to thump on the decks. "They like slashing our rigging to bits," Captain Llewellyn told Sharpe. "The Duns and the Frogs both. They like to fire at the mast, see, so the chains stop the yards falling, and the spare sheets are there if the others are shot through. Mind you, Sharpe, we'll lose a stick or two before the day's out. It rains blocks and broken spars in battle, it does." Llewellyn anticipated that dangerous downpour with relish. "Is your cutlass sharp?" "It could do with a better edge," Sharpe admitted. "Forward on the weather deck," Llewellyn said. "By the manger is a man with a treadle wheel. He'll be glad to hone it for you." Sharpe joined a queue of men. Some had cutlasses, others had boarding axes, while many had fetched down the boarding pikes which stood in racks about the masts on the upper decks. The goats, sensing that their routine had changed, bleated piteously. They had been milked for the last time, and now a seaman rolled up his sleeves before slaughtering them with a long knife. The manger, with its dangerously combustible straw, was being dismantled, and the goats' carcasses would be packed in salt for a future meal. The first beast struggled briefly, then the smell of fresh blood cut through the ship's usual stench. Some of the men invited Sharpe to go to the head of the queue, but he waited his turn as the nearby gunners teased him. "Come to see a proper battle, sir?" "You'd never win a scrap without a real soldier, lads." "These'll win it for us, sir," a man said, slapping the breech of his 24-pounder, on which someone had chalked the message, "A pill for Boney." The mess tables, on which the gunners ate, were being struck down into the hold. As much wooden furniture as possible was removed from the decks above water, so that they couldn't be reduced to splinters that whirled lethally from every strike of enemy shot. Sharpe's cot and chest were already gone, as was all the elegant furniture from Chase's quarters. The precious chronometers and the barometer had been packed in straw and taken down to the hold. Some ships hoisted their more valuable furniture high into the rigging, in the hopes that it would be safe, while others had entrusted it to the ship's boats that were being launched and towed astern to keep them from enemy gunnery. A gunner's mate sharpened the cutlass on the wheel, tested its edge against his thumb, then gave Sharpe a toothless grin. "That'll give the buggers a shave they'll never forget, sir." Sharpe tipped the man sixpence, then walked back down the deck just in time to see the panel walls of Chase's quarters being manoeuvred down the quarterdeck stairs on their way to the hold. The simpler wooden bulkheads from the officers' cabins and the wardroom at the stern of the weather deck had already been struck down, so that now, for the first time, Sharpe could see the whole length of the ship, from its wide stern windows all the way to where men swept up the last straw of the manger in the bows of the ship. The Pucelle was being stripped of her frills and turned into a fighting machine. He climbed to the quarterdeck and saw that was similarly empty. The wide space beneath the long poop, instead of holding cabins, was now an open sweep of deck, from the wheel to the windows of Chase's day cabin. The dining cabin had vanished. Sharpe's quarters were gone. The pictures had been taken below, and the only remaining luxury was the black and white checkered canvas carpet on which the two 18-pounder guns stood. Connors, stationed on the poop to watch for the flagship signals, which were being repeated by the frigate Euryalus, called down to Chase. "We're to bear up in succession on the flagship's course, sir." Chase just nodded and watched as the Victory, leading the line, swung to starboard, so that she was now heading straight for the enemy.
The wind, such as it was, came from directly behind her, and Captain Hardy, doubtless on Nelson's orders, already had men up on his yards to extend the slender poles from which he would hang his studding-sails. 9 ships behind the Pucelle, another 3-decker swung to starboard. This was the Royal Sovereign, the flagship of Admiral Collingwood, Nelson's second-in-command. A bright copper gleamed in the morning light as the ships behind followed her eastwards. Chase looked from the Victory to the Royal Sovereign, then back to the Victory again.
2 columns, he said aloud. That's what he's doing, making 2 columns.
Even Sharpe could understand that. The enemy fleet formed a ragged line that stretched for about 4 miles along the eastern horizon, and now the British fleet was turning directly towards that line. The ships turned in succession, those at the front of the fleet curling round to make a line behind the Victory, and those at the back following in the Royal Sovereign's wake, so that the 2 short lines of ships were sailing straight for the enemy, like a pair of horns thrusting at a shield.
"We'll set studding sails when we've turned, Mr. Haskell," Chase said. "Aye, aye, sir."
The Conqueror, the 5th ship in Nelson's column, and the one immediately ahead of the Pucelle, turned towards the enemy, showing Sharpe her long flank, which was painted in stripes of black and yellow. The Conqueror's gun-ports, all on the yellow bands, were painted black to give her a half-checkered appearance.
"Follow her, quartermaster,"
Chase said, then walked to the table behind the wheel where the ship's log lay open. He dipped the pen in ink and made a new entry.
6:49 a.m., turned east towards the enemy.
Chase put the pen down, then took a small notebook and a stub of pencil from his pocket.
"Mr. Collier?"
"Sir?" The midshipman looked pale.
"I will trouble you, Mr. Collier, to take this notebook and pencil, and to make a copy of any signals you see this day."
"Aye, aye, sir," Collier said, taking the book and pencil from Chase. Lieutenant Connors, the signal lieutenant, overheard the order from his place on the poop deck. He looked offended. He was an intelligent young man, quiet, red-haired, and conscientious, and Chase, seeing his unhappiness, climbed to him.
"I know that logging the signals is your responsibility, Tom," he said quietly, "but I don't want young Collier brooding. Keep him busy, eh? Let him think he's doing something useful, and he won't worry so much about being killed."
"Of course, sir," Connors said.
"Sorry, sir." "Good fellow,"
Chase said, slapping Connor's back. Then he ran back down to the quarterdeck and stared at the Conqueror, which had just completed her turn.
"There goes Pellew now!" he cried. "See how well his fellows spread their wings?"
The Conqueror's studding-sails, projecting far outboard on either side of her huge square sails, fell to catch the small wind and were sheeted home.
"It's a race now," Chase said, "and the devil take the foremost. Lively now! Lively!"
He was shouting at the men on the main yard, who had been slow to release the Pucelle's studding-sail yards, and doubtless Chase was thinking that Israel Pellew, the Cornishman commanding the Conqueror, would be watching him critically. But the yards were run out handily enough, and, the eastwards turn completed, the sails fell with a great slap and flap before the men on deck hauled them tight. The enemy was still hull down on the horizon, and the wind scarce more than a whisper.
"It'll be a long haul," Chase said ruefully. "A long, long haul." "Are you sure there are no more coffee beans?" he asked his steward.
"Only the furry ones, sir."
Try them, try them."
The British ensigns broke out at the sterns of the ships. Today, respecting Nelson's wishes, every ship flew the white ensign. Chase had been ready to hoist the red up his mizzen, for the commander of the East Indian station had been a rear admiral of the red. But when he saw the white break at the Conqueror's stern, he ordered that flag brought up from the storeroom. Even Collingwood, vice-admiral of the blue, had hoisted Nelson's beloved white at the mizzen of the huge 3-decked Royal Sovereign. Union flags were hoisted to the fore-topgallant mast and to the main topmast stay, so that every ship flew 3 flags. 2 masts might be shot away, but the British colours would still fly. The Marines were coiling down the lines of the grapnels that they had hung on the hammock nettings. The grapnels were triple-barbed hooks that could be hurled into an enemy's rigging to drag her close for boarding. The wooden tubs on the deck, in which the sail sheets were usually coiled, were being carried down below. Some ships had jettisoned theirs,
but Chase deemed that a waste of money. "Oh, by sundown, God willing, we'll be the owners of enough French and Spanish chandlery to fit out a couple of warships." He turned and took off his hat to greet Lady Grace, who had appeared on deck with her husband. "I apologize, my lady, that your cabin has been dismantled." "It seems Britain has a better use for the space today," she said, amused. "We shall restore your privacy as soon as we've dealt with those fellows," Chase said, nodding towards the enemy fleet. "But once we are within gunshot, my lady, I shall have to insist that you go below the waterline." "I'd prefer to offer my services to the surgeon," Lady Grace said. "The cockpit can't come under fire, ma'am," Chase said, "especially if the enemy depress their guns. I'd be remiss if I didn't insist you shelter in the hold. I shall have a place made ready for you." "You will go to the hold, Grace," Lord William said, "as the captain orders you." "As must you, my lord," Chase said. Lord William shrugged. "I can fire a musket, Chase." "Doubtless you can, my lord, but we must gauge whether you're more valuable to Britain alive than dead." Lord William nodded. "If you say so, Chase, if you say so." Was he relieved? Sharpe couldn't tell. But certainly Lord William was making no great effort to persuade Chase to let him stay on deck. "How long till you close on them?" Lord William asked. 5 hours at least," Chase said. "Probably 6. A seaman was casting the log that brought ill news with every throw. 2 knots slipped through his fingers, sometimes 3, but it was slow going, even though Chase was cramming every sail onto the masts. Sharpe stood 10 paces from Lady Grace, not daring to look at her, but acutely aware of her. Pregnant. He felt his heart leap with a strange happiness. Then he flinched as he realized that they must soon be parted. And what would happen to his child then? He stared fixedly down into the weather-deck, where 2 gunners were attaching the flintlocks to the guns. Another gunner received permission to come to the quarter-deck to arm the 12 18-pounder cannons and the 4 32-pounder carronades. 2 more of the brutal carronades squatted on the forecastle. They were short-barrelled and wide-mouthed, capable of belching a terrible onslaught of musket and cannonballs at an enemy's deck. End of Side 7. Side 8. A dozen gunners were now in Chase's quarters, marvelling at the gilded beams and delicately carved windows. Small tubs of water for swabbing the guns or slaking the men's thirst were placed beside every cannon, while other men threw water on the decks and the ship's sides, so that the dampened timber would be slow to catch fire. Match tubs were readied, half filled with water and capped with a pierced lid, through which a slow match hung, in case a flintlock should break. Down in the orlop deck, men coiled an anchor cable to make a gigantic bed on which the wounded could be laid as they waited to see Pickering, the surgeon, who was singing as he laid out his knives, saws, probes, and pincers. The carpenter was putting shot plugs all about the orlop deck. The plugs were great cones of wood, thickly smeared with tallow, that could be rammed into any hole punched close to the waterline. Relieving ropes were laid for the rudder, so that if the wheel was shot away, or the tiller rope severed by a round shot, the ship could be steered from the weather-deck. Leather fire buckets, most filled with sand, stood in clusters. The powder monkeys, small boys of 10 or 11, brought up the first charges from the magazines. Chase had ordered blue bags, which were the middle size of charge. The biggest powder charges, in black bags, were used when firing at long range. The blue were more than adequate for a close-range fight, while even the red bags, which had the smallest charge, and were usually used for signalling, could smash a shot through an enemy's ship's side at point-blank range. "By day's end," Chase said wistfully, "we'll probably be double-loading Reds." He suddenly brightened. "My God! It's my birthday! Mr. Haskell, you owe me 10 guineas. You recall our wager? I said, did I not, that we should come up with a revenant on my birthday?" "I shall pay gladly, sir." "You'll pay nothing, Mr. Haskell, nothing. If Nelson hadn't been here, then the revenant would have escaped us. It ain't fair for a captain to win a bet with an admiral's help. This coffee tastes good. The fur adds piquancy, don't you think?" The galley cooked a last burgoo, a generous one, with great chunks of pork and beef floating in the greasy oats. It would be the last hot meal the men would enjoy before battle, for the galley fires would have to be doused
in case an enemy shot struck the oven and scattered fire across a gun deck where the powder bags waited to be loaded. The men ate the meal sitting on the deck, while the boatswain's mates took round a double ration of rum. A band began playing on the Conqueror.
"Where's our band?"
Chase demanded.
"Have them play! Have them play! I'd like some music!"
But before the band could gather, the Victory signalled to Pucelle, a signal that was repeated by the Euryalus.
"Our number, sir!"
Lieutenant Connor shouted, then watched the frigate that sailed wide out on the larboard side of Nelson's column.
"You're invited to take breakfast with the Admiral, sir."
"I am?" Chase sounded delighted.
"Inform his lordship I'm on my way."
The barge crew was summoned, while the barge itself, which was already on tow behind the ship, was hauled up to the starboard side. Lord William stepped forward, plainly expecting to accompany Chase to the Victory, but the captain turned to Sharpe instead.
"You'll come, Sharpe? Of course you will."
"Me?" Sharpe blinked in astonishment.
"I'm not dressed to meet an admiral, sir." "You look fine, Sharpe. Ragged, perhaps, but fine."
Chase, blithely ignoring Lord William's ill-concealed indignation, dropped his voice.
"Besides, he'll expect me to bring a lieutenant, but if I take Haskell, Peel will never forgive me, and if I take Peel, Haskell will feel slighted, so you'll have to do."
Chase grinned, pleased with the idea of introducing Sharpe to his beloved Nelson.
"And you'll divert him, Sharpe. He's a perverse man. He likes soldiers."
Chase drew Sharpe forward as the barge crew, led by the huge Hopper, scrambled down the steps built into the Pucelle's side.
"You go first, Sharpe," Chase said. "The boys will make sure you don't get a bath."
The side of a warship leant steeply inwards, for the ships were built to bulge out close to the waterline, and that generous slope made the first few steps easy enough. But the nearer Sharpe came to the waterline, the steeper the narrow steps became. And, though there was scarcely any wind, the Pucelle was rising and falling in the big swells, while the barge was falling and rising, and Sharpe could feel his boots sliding on the lower wooden ledges that were slimy with growth.
"Hold it there, sir!"
Hopper growled at him, then shouted,
"Now!"
And 2 pairs of hands unceremoniously grasped Sharpe by his breeches and jacket and hauled him safe into the barge. Clouter, the escaped slave, was one of his helpers, and he grinned as Sharpe found his feet. Chase came nimbly down the steps, glanced once at the pitching barge, then stepped gracefully onto the rear thwart.
"It'll be a stiff pull, Hopper." "It'll be easy enough, sir, easy enough."
Chase took the tiller himself, while Hopper sat at an oar. It was indeed a hard pull, and a long one, but the barge crept past the intervening ships, and Sharpe could stare up at their massive striped sides. From the white and red barge, low down among the swells, the ships looked vast, cumbersome, and indestructible.
"I also brought you," Chase grinned at Sharpe, "because your inclusion will annoy Lord William. He doubtless thinks he should have been invited. But bless me, how he would bore Nelson."
Chase waved to an officer high on the stern of a 74.
"That's the Leviathan," he told Sharpe, "under Harry Bainton. He's a prime fellow, prime. I served with him in the old Bellona. I was only a youngster, but they were happy days, happy days."
The swell lifted the Leviathan's stern, revealing an expanse of green copper and trailing weed.
"Besides," Chase went on, "Nelson could be useful to you." "Useful?" "Lord William don't like you," Chase said, not bothering that he was being overheard by Hopper and Clouter, who had the 2 stroke oars nearest the stern. "Which means he'll try and obstruct your career. But I know Nelson's a friend of Colonel Stewart, and Stewart's one of your strange riflemen, so perhaps his lordship will put in a word for you." "Of course he will. He's the very soul of generosity."
It took a half-hour to reach the flagship, but at last Chase steered the barge into the Victory's starboard flank, and one of his men hooked onto its chains, so that the small boat was held just beneath another ladder as steep and perilous as the one Sharpe had descended on the Pucelle. A gilded entryway was halfway up the ladder, but its door was closed, meaning Sharpe must climb all the way to the top.
"You first, Sharpe," Chase said. "Jump and cling on."
"God help me," Sharpe muttered. He stood on a thwart, twisted the cutlass out of his way, and leapt for the ladder when the barge was heaved up by a wave. He clung on desperately, then climbed past the entryway's gilded frame. A hand reached down from the weather deck and hauled him through the entry port, where a line of boatswain's mates waited to welcome Chase with their whistles. Chase was grinning as he scrambled up the side. A lieutenant, immaculately uniformed, saluted him, then inclined his head when Sharpe was introduced. "You're most welcome, sir," the lieutenant told Chase. "Another 74 today is a blessing from heaven." "It's good of you to let me join the celebrations," Chase said, removing his hat to salute the quarterdeck. Sharpe hurriedly followed suit as the boatswain's whistles made their strange twittering sound. The Victory's upper decks were crowded with gunners, sail-handlers, and marines, who ignored the visitors, though one older man, a sailmaker, judging from the big needles thrust into his grey hair, which was bundled on top of his head, did bob down as Chase was led towards the quarterdeck. Chase stopped, clicked his fingers. "Prout, isn't it? You were on the Bellona with me." "I remembers you, sir," Prout said, tugging the hair over his forehead. "And you was just a boy, sir." "We grow old, Prout," Chase said. "We grow damned old, but not too old to give the Dons and Frenchmen a drubbing, eh?" "We shall beat 'em, sir," Prout said. Chase beamed at his old shipmate, then went to the quarterdeck, which was thickly crowded with officers who politely removed their hats as Chase and Sharpe were ushered aft past the great wheel and under the poop to the Admiral's quarters, which were guarded by a single marine in a short red jacket crossed by a pair of pipe-clayed belts. The lieutenant opened the door without knocking and led Chase and Sharpe through a small sleeping cabin, which had been stripped of its furniture, and then, again without knocking, into a massive cabin that stretched the whole width of the ship and was lit by the wide array of stern windows. This cabin had also been emptied of its furniture, so that only a single table was left on the black and white checkered canvas floor. Two massive guns, already equipped with their flintlocks, stood on either side of the table. Sharpe was aware of two men silhouetted against the stern window, but he couldn't distinguish which was the Admiral until Chase put his hat under his arm and offered a bow to the smaller man who was seated at the table. The light was bright behind the Admiral, and Sharpe still couldn't see him clearly, and he hung back, not wanting to intrude. But Chase turned and gestured him forward. "Allow me to name my particular friend, my lord, Mr. Richard Sharpe. He's on his way to join the Rifles, but he paused long enough to save me from an embarrassment in Bombay, and I'm monstrous grateful." "You, Chase? An embarrassment? Surely not." Nelson laughed and gave Sharpe a smile. "I'm most grateful to you, Sharpe. I would not have my friends embarrassed. How long has it been, Chase?" 4 years, my lord." "He was one of my frigate captains," Nelson said to his companion, a post-captain who stood at his shoulder. "He commanded the Sprightly and took the Bouvine a week after leaving my command. I never had the chance to congratulate you, Chase, but I do now. It was a creditable action. You know Blackwood." "I'm honoured to make your acquaintance," Chase said, bowing to the Honourable Henry Blackwood, who commanded the frigate Euryalus. "Captain Blackwood has been hanging on to the enemy's apron strings ever since they left Cadiz," Nelson said warmly, "and you've drawn us together now, Blackwood, so your work's done." "I trust I shall have the honour of doing more, my lord." "Doubtless you will, Blackwood," Nelson said, then gestured at the chairs. "Sit, Chase, sit. And you, Mr. Sharpe. Tepid coffee, hard bread, cold beef, and fresh oranges. Not much of a breakfast, I fear, but they tell me the galley's been struck." The table was set with plates and knives, amongst which the Admiral's sword lay in its jewelled scabbard. "How are your supplies, Chase?" "Low, my lord. Water and beef for 2 weeks, maybe." "'Twill be long enough, long enough." "Crew?" "I pressed a score of good men from an Indiaman, my lord, and half sufficient." "Good, good," the Admiral said. Then, after his steward had brought coffee and food to the table, he questioned Chase about his voyage and the pursuit of the Rivenal. Sharpe, sitting to the Admiral's left, watched him. He knew the Admiral had lost the sight of one eye, but it was hard to tell which, though after a while Sharpe saw that the right eye had an unnaturally large and dark pupil. His hair was white and tousled, framing a thin and extraordinarily mobile face that reacted to Chase's story with alarm, pleasure, amusement, and surprise. He interrupted Chase rarely, though he did stop the tale once to request that Sharpe carve the beef. "And perhaps you'll cut me some bread as well, Mr. Sharpe, as a kindness. My fin, you understand." And he touched his empty right sleeve that was pinned onto a jacket bright with jewelled stars. "You're very kind," he said when Sharpe had obeyed. "Do go on, Chase." Sharpe had expected to be awed by the Admiral, to be struck dumb by him, but instead he found himself feeling protective of the small man who emanated a fragile air of vulnerability. Even though he was sitting, it was clear he was a small man, and very thin, and his pale, lined face suggested he was prone to sickness. He looked so frail that Sharpe had to remind himself that this man had led his fleets to victory after victory, and that in every fight he'd been in the thick of the battle. Yet he gave the impression that the slightest breeze would knock him down. The Admiral's apparent frailty made the most immediate impression on Sharpe, but it was the Admiral's eyes that had the stronger effect. For whenever he looked at Sharpe, even if it was merely to request a small service, like another piece of butter bread, it seemed that Sharpe became the most important person in the world at that moment. The glance seemed to exclude everything and everyone else, as though Sharpe and the Admiral were in collusion. Nelson had none of Sir Arthur Wellesley's coldness, no condescension, and gave no impression of believing himself to be superior. Indeed, it seemed to Sharpe that at that moment, as the fleet lumbered towards the enemy, Horatio Nelson asked nothing from life except to be seated with his good friends Chase, Blackwood, and Richard Sharpe. He touched Sharpe's elbow once. "This talk must be tedious to a soldier, Sharpe." "No, my lord," Sharpe said. The discussion had moved on to the Admiral's tactics this day, and much of it was beyond Sharpe's comprehension. But he didn't care. It was enough to be in Nelson's presence, and Sharpe was swept by the little man's infectious enthusiasm. By God, Sharpe thought, but they wouldn't just beat the enemy fleet this day, but pound it into splinters, hammer it so badly that no French or Spanish ship would ever dare sail the world's seas again. Chase, he saw, was reacting the same way, almost as though he feared Nelson would weep if he didn't fight harder than he'd ever fought before. "Do you put your men in the tops?" Nelson asked, clumsily attempting to remove the peel of an orange with his one hand. "I do, my lord." "I do fear that the musket wads will fire the sails," the Admiral said gently. "So I'd rather you didn't." "Of course not, my lord," Chase said, immediately yielding to the modest suggestion. "Sails are only linen, after all," Nelson said, evidently wanting to explain himself further, in case Chase had been offended by the order. "And what do we put inside tinderboxes? Linen. It's horribly flammable." "I shall respect your wishes gladly, my lord." "And you comprehend my greater purpose?" the Admiral asked, referring to his earlier discussion of tactics. "I do, my lord, and applaud it." "I shall not be happy with less than 20 prizes, Chase," Nelson said sternly. "So few, my lord?" The Admiral laughed, and then, as another officer entered the cabin, stood. Nelson was at least a half-foot shorter than Sharpe, who, standing like the others, had to stoop beneath the beams. But the newcomer, who was introduced as the Victory's captain, Thomas Hardy, was a half-foot taller than Sharpe again, and when he spoke to Nelson, he bent over the little Admiral like a protective giant. "Of course, Hardy, of course," the Admiral said, then smiled at his guests. "Hardy tells me it's time to strike down these bulkheads. We're being evicted, gentlemen. Shall we retreat to the quarter-deck?" He led his guests forward. Then, seeing Sharpe hang back, he turned and took his elbow. "Did you serve under Sir Arthur Wellesley in India, Sharpe?" "I did, my lord." "I met him after his return, and enjoyed a notable conversation, though I confess I found him rather frightening." The Admiral's tone made Sharpe laugh, which pleased Nelson. "So you're joining the 95th, are you?" "I am, my lord." "That's splendid." The Admiral, for some reason, seemed particularly pleased by this news. He ushered Sharpe through the door, then walked him across to the hammock nettings on the larboard side of the quarter-deck. "You're fortunate indeed, Mr. Sharpe. I know William Stewart, and count him amongst my dearest and closest friends. You know why his rifle regiment is so good?" "No, my lord," Sharpe said. He'd always thought that the new-fangled 95th was probably made of the army's leavings, and was dressed in green because no one wanted to waste good red cloth on its soldiers. "Because they're intelligent," the Admiral said enthusiastically. "Intelligent. It's a quality sadly despised by the military, but intelligence does have its uses." He looked up at Sharpe's face, peering at the tiny blue-flecked marks on Sharpe's scarred cheek. "Powder scars, Mr. Sharpe. And I note you're still an ensign. Would I offend you by suspecting that you once served in the ranks?" "I did, my lord." "Then you have my warmest admiration, indeed you do," Nelson said energetically, and his admiration seemed entirely genuine. You must be a remarkable man," the Admiral added.
"No, my lord,"
Sharpe said, and he wanted to say that Nelson was the man to admire, but he didn't know how to phrase the compliment.
"You're modest, Mr. Sharpe, and that is not good,"
Nelson said sternly. To Sharpe's surprise, he found he was alone with the Admiral. Chase, Blackwood, and the other officers stood on the starboard side, while Nelson and Sharpe paced up and down under the larboard hammock nettings. A dozen seamen, grinning at their Admiral, had begun collapsing the panel bulkheads so that no enemy shot could turn them into lethal splinters that could sweep the quarterdeck.
"I'm not in favour of modesty,"
Nelson said, and once again the Admiral was overwhelming Sharpe with a flattering intimacy.
"And you doubtless find that surprising. We are told, are we not, that modesty is among the virtues, but modesty is not a warrior's virtue. You and I, Sharpe, have been forced to rise from a lowly place, and we do not achieve that by hiding our talents. I am a country clergyman's son, and now—"
He waved his one hand at the far enemy fleet, then unconsciously touched the 4 brilliant stars, the jewel decorations of his orders of knighthood, that glinted on the left breast of his coat.
"Be proud of what you've done," he said to Sharpe. "Then go and do better."
"As you will, my lord."
"No,"
Nelson said abruptly, and for a moment he looked desperately frail again.
"No," he repeated, "for in bringing these 2 fleets together, Sharpe, I would have done my life's work."
He looked so forlorn that Sharpe had a ridiculous urge to comfort the Admiral.
"Kill those ships," Nelson went on, gesturing at the enemy fleet filling the eastern horizon, "and Bonaparte and his allies can never invade England. We should have caged the beast in Europe, and what will be left for a poor sailor to do then, eh?"
He smiled.
"But there'll be work for soldiers, and you, I know, are a good one. Just remember, though, you must hate a Frenchman like the very devil."